It was supposed to be a quiet weekend in the woods, just me, my backpack, and the trees. I've always enjoyed solo camping trips. There's something about the solitude, the crackle of the fire, and the absence of distractions that makes me feel alive. But this trip was different. It left a mark on me in ways I never expected. I picked a spot in a national forest a few hours from home, a place I had researched online. It was known for its rugged terrain, scenic trails, and lack of cell service. Perfect. I wanted to disconnect completely for a couple of days. My plan was simple: hike to a secluded spot by the river, set up camp, and spend 2 nights under the stars. I arrived early Friday morning, parked my car at the trailhead, and double-checked my gear. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, first aid kit. Everything was accounted for. The trail was about 6 miles to the spot I had in mind, a clearing near the river that was supposedly less trafficked than other areas. The air was crisp, the kind of fresh that fills your lungs and makes you feel awake. The trail started off wide and well-marked, winding through towering pines and patches of ferns. I felt a sense of peace as I walked, the weight of my pack a comforting presence on my back. About 2 miles in, the trail narrowed, and the trees grew denser. I noticed fewer signs of other hikers, no footprints, no discarded wrappers, nothing. It was exactly what I was looking for. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional chirp of a bird. Every now and then, I'd hear the distant rush of the river, growing louder as I got closer. I reached the clearing by mid-afternoon. It was perfect. The ground was flat, and the river was about 50 yards away, its water clear and fast-moving. There were no signs of anyone having camped there recently. I set down my pack and began to set up my tent. The process was methodical, almost meditative. Once the tent was up, I gathered some firewood from the surrounding area, careful to only pick up dry, fallen branches. By the time I got the fire going, the sun was starting to dip below the treetops, casting long shadows across the clearing. Dinner was simple: a freeze-dried meal rehydrated with boiling water. As I ate, I watched the fire dance and listened to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, the kind of peace you only find far away from the hum of civilization. When the stars came out, I felt a sense of awe. The sky was so clear that I could see the Milky Way stretching across the darkness. It was mesmerizing. I crawled into my tent around 10 p.m., tired from the hike and the fresh air. The rhythmic sound of the river was soothing, like nature's lullaby. I fell asleep quickly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The forest was silent except for the river. I lay still, listening, trying to pinpoint what had disturbed my sleep. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling, like leaves being disturbed. It was subtle, almost too quiet to notice, but it was there. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. Animals are active at night, and I was in their territory. Still, I felt uneasy. The sound continued, sporadic and soft. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on, and pointed it toward the tent wall. Nothing. I unzipped the tent and shone the light outside. The clearing was empty. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting faint light on the surrounding area. I didn't see anything unusual. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back inside. The next morning, I felt a little foolish for being so on edge. The sun was shining, the forest was alive with birdsong, and everything seemed normal. I made coffee and oatmeal, packed a small bag, and decided to spend the day exploring the area. There were no marked trails near my campsite, so I followed the river upstream, keeping it in sight as I walked. The terrain was rough, with uneven ground and dense underbrush, but I enjoyed the challenge. I found a small waterfall about a mile from camp and spent some time there, enjoying the sound of the water and the solitude. By the time I returned to camp, it was late afternoon. The clearing looked just as I had left it, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air seemed heavier, the silence deeper. I tried to shake off the feeling as I gathered more firewood and prepared dinner. As the sun set, the unease grew. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees for no reason. The forest felt different, as if it were watching me. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. I kept telling myself it was just the forest being the forest, but the logic didn't help. My body was tense, my mind racing. Sometime after midnight, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of heavy footsteps. Not the light, sporadic steps of an animal, but deliberate, measured steps. Human steps. My heart pounded as I lay there, frozen. The footsteps were coming from the direction of the river, moving toward my tent. They stopped just outside. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Then, the footsteps started again, circling the tent slowly. I've never felt fear like that before, a primal kind of fear that made every muscle in my body scream at me to run. But I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe properly. The footsteps stopped again, and for a long time, there was nothing but silence. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting, listening. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up, it was dawn. The first thing I did was check around the campsite. There were no signs of anyone. No footprints, no disturbed ground, nothing. It didn't make sense. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, that my mind had played tricks on me in the dark. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I decided to cut the trip short. I packed up my gear quickly, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest, which had felt so welcoming on the first day, now felt oppressive. The hike back to the trailhead was nerve-wracking. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I felt like I was being watched, but every time I stopped to look around, I saw nothing. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly brought me to tears. I threw my pack in the back, got in, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was a person, maybe it wasn't. All I know is that something was out there, and it was aware of me. I haven't been camping alone since, and I'm not sure I ever will again. It started as a simple weekend trip. I'd always loved the outdoors, and there was something about camping that let me reset. Just me, a tent, and miles of untouched wilderness. I had taken some time off work, needing a break from the endless grind. A friend had mentioned a remote campsite near the national forest, a place that was supposedly untouched by the crowds that normally swarmed the more popular spots. That's what I wanted. Quiet, isolation, peace. The drive out was long and winding, the kind where the roads get narrower the further you go, until you're navigating unpaved paths littered with potholes. My car's suspension groaned in protest, but I pressed on, determined to make it to the spot my friend had recommended. The directions were straightforward. Follow the dirt road for 10 miles, park by the clearing, and hike another 3 miles to the site. Sounded perfect. When I arrived at the clearing, it was already mid-afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I grabbed my pack, double-checked my supplies, and locked the car. I had everything I needed: food, water, a first aid kit, a map, and a GPS device for good measure. The trail was faint but visible, winding its way through dense trees. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of pine and moss. The hike in was uneventful, though the forest felt eerily quiet. No birds chirping, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just the crunch of my boots on the trail and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I chalked it up to being deeper in the woods than usual. Wildlife tends to avoid humans, and this place was as remote as it got. When I reached the campsite, I couldn't help but smile. It was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by towering trees, with a gentle slope leading down to a crystal-clear stream. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, facing the stream. The sound of the water was soothing, a constant murmur that blended into the background. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal. The flames danced in the growing darkness, casting flickering shadows on the trees around me. I leaned back against a log, sipping on a cup of instant coffee, feeling the tension of the past weeks melt away. The stars began to appear, first a few, then a blanket of them, brighter than I'd ever seen in the city. It was moments like this that reminded me why I loved being out here. By the time I crawled into my tent, the forest was pitch black. I zipped up the flap, slid into my sleeping bag, and let the rhythmic sound of the stream lull me to sleep. I woke up suddenly, disoriented. My heart was pounding, though I wasn't sure why. Took a moment to remember where I was. The tent was dark, and the forest outside was silent. Too silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. My instincts told me something was off. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam illuminated the inside of the tent, revealing nothing unusual. I listened for any sounds, holding my breath. Then I heard it, a faint crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. It was distant, but unmistakable. My grip tightened on the flashlight as I strained to hear more. Another crunch, closer this time. My mind raced. Could be an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe a raccoon. But the steps were deliberate, too heavy for a small animal. I felt a chill run down my spine. I debated whether to unzip the tent and look outside. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to stay hidden and hope whatever it was would move on. But another part, the part that valued preparation and caution, urged me to investigate. I grabbed the hunting knife I'd packed and slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to peer out. The forest was still, bathed in the pale light of the moon. Shadows stretched across the ground, but I couldn't see anything unusual. I stepped out cautiously, my flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other. The air was cold against my skin, and every step I took seemed deafeningly loud. I circled the campsite, scanning the area with my flashlight. Nothing. No signs of movement. No glowing eyes reflecting the light. Just the trees, the stream, and the endless darkness. I told myself I was being paranoid and headed back to the tent, though my nerves were still on edge. The rest of the night passed without incident, though I slept lightly, waking at every little sound. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief. The morning light chased away the unease of the night, and I convinced myself it had been my imagination. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, filled with vibrant greens and the sound of birds chirping. I followed the stream for a while, enjoying the solitude. As I walked, I kept an eye out for tracks or signs of wildlife, curious about what might have been near my campsite the night before. About a mile downstream, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. There, in the soft mud by the edge of the stream, was a footprint. Human, barefoot. It was large, larger than my own, and the toes were splayed wide as if whoever made it had been walking naturally without shoes. A shiver ran through me. I scanned the area, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings. The forest seemed different now, less inviting. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I considered turning back to the campsite, but decided to press on a little further. I needed to know if there was more to this. As I continued, I found more footprints, all leading deeper into the woods. They were sporadic, sometimes overlapping, as if whoever left them had been wandering aimlessly. The prints seemed fresh, not more than a day old. My stomach tightened. By midday, I was back at my campsite, feeling uneasy. I couldn't shake the image of those footprints. Who else would be out here, miles from the nearest road, walking barefoot? It didn't make sense. I decided to cut my trip short and leave the next morning. That night, I built a larger fire, its light casting a wide circle around my camp. I kept my knife close and stayed alert, listening for any unusual sounds. The forest was quiet, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the calm before a storm. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and too close for comfort. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and knife. I scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, waiting for dawn. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. The hike back to my car was nerve-wracking. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. When I finally reached the clearing where my car was parked, I felt a wave of relief. I tossed my pack into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a figure partially hidden among the trees watching me. It was too far away to make out any details, but I knew it wasn't an animal. I didn't wait to find out more. I put the car in gear and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I was miles away. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I got home, I told myself I'd been paranoid, that the footprints and noises could be explained away. But deep down, I knew better. Someone had been out there watching me, and whoever they were, they hadn't wanted me to know they were there. It was late October when I decided to head out on a solo camping trip. I had been itching to get away from the city and lose myself in the quiet of the woods. The air was crisp, and the leaves were a symphony of orange, red, and gold. I picked a remote spot, one that I had scouted online. It was a few miles off the main trail, secluded, perfect for solitude. I packed light but smart. A tent, a sleeping bag, enough food and water for 3 days, a map, a compass, and a small emergency kit. The hike to the campsite was uneventful. The sun filtered through the thinning canopy, casting long shadows on the ground. Occasionally, a breeze would stir the leaves, sending them skittering across the forest floor. I reached my chosen spot by mid-afternoon, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and oaks. It was serene. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and set up camp. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I had a small fire crackling and a pot of instant noodles warming up. The first night was uneventful. I fell asleep to the sound of the wind whispering through the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. When I woke up the next morning, the forest was bathed in a pale golden light. I spent the day exploring the area, taking note of landmarks to ensure I wouldn't get lost. There was a stream not too far from my campsite, its water clear and cold. I refilled my water bottles there and sat for a while, listening to the gentle gurgle of the current. Everything felt peaceful. It was that evening when things started to feel off. As I was preparing my dinner, I noticed the forest had gone unnaturally quiet. The usual rustle of animals in the underbrush, the calls of birds, all of it had stopped. The only sound was the crackling of my fire. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe I just wasn't paying attention, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I woke up suddenly. first, I wasn't sure why. My heart was pounding, but everything was still. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light around the clearing. I lay there listening. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was slow, deliberate. My first thought was that it might be a deer, but the steps were too heavy. It sounded like a person. I stayed completely still, my ears straining. The footsteps seemed to circle the campsite, moving closer, then farther away. I reached for the flashlight next to my sleeping bag, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my exact position. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. I lay there for hours, too afraid to move, until exhaustion finally overtook me. The next morning, I found nothing unusual around the campsite. No footprints, no signs of anyone or anything. I convinced myself it must have been an animal, maybe a bear or a large raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. I decided to stay one more night and leave early the next morning. That day, I stuck close to the campsite, gathering more firewood and double-checking my gear. I kept my knife on me at all times, feeling a bit ridiculous but safer nonetheless. As the sun set, the forest fell into silence again. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the warmth of the fire and the simple task of eating dinner. But the tension in my chest wouldn't go away. That night, I woke up again. This time, it was to the sound of something brushing against my tent. It was soft, almost like a hand grazing the fabric. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. The sound came again, a faint scraping along the side of the tent. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I didn't hear footsteps or any movement, just the oppressive silence of the forest. When dawn finally broke, I stepped out of the tent, my knife still in hand. The clearing looked the same as it always had, but I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Around the tent, the leaves had been disturbed, forming a rough circle. It wasn't an animal. The pattern was too deliberate, too intentional. Someone had been there. I decided then and there to pack up and leave. I stuffed my gear into my backpack, doused the fire, and started back toward the main trail. My heart was pounding the entire time. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set me on edge. I felt like I was being watched, though I never saw anyone. About an hour into the hike, I came across something that made me stop in my tracks. A small pile of stones sat in the middle of the path. They hadn't been there when I first came through. The stones were stacked carefully, almost ritualistically. My stomach churned. I stepped around it and quickened my pace, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. As I neared the trailhead, I began to hear the faint sound of running water. Relief washed over me. The stream was a landmark. I was close to the end, but as I approached, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the bank of the stream, partially submerged in the water, was a single boot. It looked old and worn, but it was unmistakably human. I didn't stick around to investigate. I crossed the stream and practically ran the rest of the way back to my car. When I finally reached the parking lot, I was shaking. My car was the only one there. I tossed my gear into the back seat, jumped in, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But the road behind me remained empty. It's been weeks since that trip, and I still can't explain what happened. I've replayed it over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just some prankster trying to scare me, or maybe it was something more sinister. All I know is that I've lost my desire for solo camping. The woods don't feel like a refuge anymore. They feel like a place where you can disappear without a trace. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a much-needed escape from the noise and chaos of city life. I'd planned it meticulously, every detail accounted for. Food, water, camping gear, and the best trails mapped out in the rugged forest I'd read so much about online. I was looking forward to the silence, the kind you can only find deep in nature, where your thoughts don't have to compete with the hum of traffic or the buzz of notifications. Just me, the forest, and the stars. I set out early Saturday morning, driving for hours until the city faded into fields and the fields gave way to dense, towering trees. The parking lot at the trailhead was nearly empty, just one or two other cars, their owners already swallowed by the wilderness. That was exactly what I'd hoped for. I didn't want to see anyone. This trip was about solitude. The trail started easy, winding through clusters of pine and maple, the dirt path soft beneath my boots. The air smelled clean, tinged with pine resin and damp earth. I checked the weather forecast repeatedly in the days leading up to the trip, and it promised clear skies all weekend, perfect for camping. After a few hours of hiking, I reached the spot I'd marked on my map, a small clearing near a creek. The sound of water rushing over rocks was soothing, and the trees here formed a natural barrier, making the area feel secluded. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and ate a simple lunch of trail mix and jerky. The rest of the afternoon was spent exploring the area, following the creek upstream and marveling at the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, I was back at camp, building a fire. The flames crackled to life, and I sat there, staring into them, letting my mind wander. It felt good to disconnect, to let go of the constant need to be doing something. Here, in the middle of nowhere, there was nothing to do but exist. As darkness settled in, the forest came alive with sounds. Crickets chirped, frogs croaked from the creek, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. I wasn't afraid, not yet. I'd been camping before, and these were the sounds I'd expected. They were normal. I crawled into my tent around 10 p.m., zipping myself into my sleeping bag. The ground was hard, but I'd brought a foam pad to cushion it. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but it would do. I lay there, listening to the symphony of the night, and eventually drifted off to sleep. I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but as my mind cleared, I realized it was real. Something was moving outside the tent. My heart started pounding, and I lay completely still, straining to hear. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the crunch of leaves underfoot. My first thought was that it might be an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But the sound wasn't random like an animal foraging. It was deliberate, measured. Footsteps. I'd seen no one on the trail all day. Who would be out here in the middle of the night? My pulse quickened as I considered my options. I had a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a small canister of bear spray. None of them felt adequate against the sudden, primal fear coursing through me. The footsteps grew louder, circling the tent. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be stealthy anymore. I reached for the flashlight, my hand trembling, and clicked it on. The beam of light illuminated the tent's nylon walls, but beyond that, I could see nothing. "Hello," I finally called out, my voice shaky. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound of someone moving. I held my breath, waiting for a response, but none came. After what felt like an eternity, I unzipped the tent slightly and shone the flashlight outside. The clearing was empty as far as I could tell. No movement, no sign of anyone. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting upright in my sleeping bag with the bear spray clutched in one hand and the flashlight in the other. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent my nerves into overdrive. But nothing else happened, and as dawn broke, the fear that had gripped me began to loosen its hold. When the sun was fully up, I stepped out of the tent, scanning the area. There were no footprints around the tent, at least none that I could see. It didn't make sense. I told myself it must have been an animal after all, even if it didn't seem likely. The alternative was too unsettling to dwell on. I considered packing up and heading back to the car, but something stubborn in me refused. I'd come all this way to escape, to find peace, and I wasn't going to let one sleepless night ruin that. I spent the day hiking further along the creek, trying to push the night's events out of my mind. By the time I returned to camp, the sunlight was fading again. I rebuilt the fire, cooked a quick dinner, and sat watching the flames. The woods felt different now, heavier somehow, as if they were watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though logic told me I was. That night, I decided to sleep with the bear spray and flashlight within arm's reach. I'd even set up a makeshift alarm system using my mess kit, a few pots and pans balanced precariously on a log near the tent entrance. If anything came close, the clatter would wake me. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when the sound of metal crashing jolted me awake. My heart felt like it was going to explode as I grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on. The pots and pans were scattered on the ground, but no one was there. The clearing was empty, just like the night before. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun rose, I packed up my gear and started the hike back to the car. Every step felt like a marathon. My legs heavy with exhaustion and my mind clouded with paranoia. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the trail remained empty. When I finally reached the parking lot, relief washed over me. My car was still there, undisturbed. I loaded my gear, got in, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced I'd see something. But there was nothing. I've thought about that trip countless times since. I've tried to rationalize what happened, to explain the footsteps, the scattered pots, the overwhelming sense of being watched. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know there's a part of the forest we can't understand, something that exists just beyond the edges of our comprehension. I haven't been camping since. The air was thick with the scent of pine trees, the ground beneath my boots soft and damp from the early morning mist. The trail stretched ahead, winding through the dense forest, a path carved by countless footsteps over the years. I had been preparing for this hike for months, but standing there at the trailhead, something stirred inside me. An unfamiliar twinge, a sensation I couldn't quite explain. I pushed it aside, focusing instead on the task ahead. This was my time to reconnect with nature, to get away from the distractions of daily life, and to find some peace of mind. The first few miles were peaceful, with the sunlight filtering through the branches above, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. Birds flitted between the trees, their calls a pleasant soundtrack to the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. I kept a steady pace, adjusting the straps of my backpack as it shifted slightly with each step. I was used to hiking, but this time felt different. Maybe it was the solitude. Maybe it was the unfamiliarity of the area. I'd hiked in the mountains before, but this trail was new to me. I'd read about it online. The reviews said it was challenging but not overly difficult. Some had claimed it was one of the most beautiful trails they had ever experienced. Others warned of sudden weather changes and tricky terrain. But I was prepared. I had everything I needed: plenty of water, high-energy snacks, a map, a compass, and my phone, just in case. Nothing to worry about. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed how quiet it was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the eerie kind that presses against your ears, making you acutely aware of every sound. Your footsteps, your breathing, the rustle of leaves in the distance. I paused for a moment, listening, but the usual forest sounds seemed muffled, distant. almost as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The trail began to narrow, the path less clear, the trees thicker and the ground uneven. I was starting to feel the weight of the hike, and the steady rhythm of my steps had turned into more of a march. I stopped to take a sip of water, wiping my brow with the back of my hand. It wasn't particularly hot, but the exertion was starting to get to me. There was no sign of anyone else, no other hikers, no distant voices. I was alone. It was a strange feeling, one I couldn't quite shake. I pushed forward, convincing myself it was all in my head. After all, I had been on my own plenty of times before, and nothing bad had ever happened. But today was different. The trees seemed to crowd in closer, their branches interlocking above me like a canopy that shut out more light with each step. I glanced at the sky, still clear, but the shadows were lengthening. I had made decent time, but I knew I had to be mindful of the daylight. It wasn't long before I reached a clearing. The sun was low in the sky now, casting long shadows across the field of tall grasses that had overtaken much of the space. I stood there for a moment, taking in the view, an untouched patch of wilderness that seemed both serene and intimidating. The wind had picked up, and the rustling of the grass added to the odd, unsettling silence. I checked my map, scanning it to make sure I was still on course. According to the directions, there should be a small creek not far from here. I decided to press on. It wasn't until I was about to leave the clearing that I saw something strange. A small object partially buried in the dirt near the edge of the trail. I crouched down to inspect it, brushing away the soil with my fingers. It was a piece of old, weathered rope, frayed at the edges and covered in dirt. Not particularly remarkable on its own, but it struck me as odd. Who would leave something like that out here? It seemed out of place, as if someone had dropped it in a hurry. I stood there for a moment, uncertain. Something about it felt wrong, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. There were probably plenty of hikers who had come through this area over the years, and the rope could have just been left behind by someone who didn't bother to clean up after themselves. I placed the rope back in its spot and walked away, but the feeling didn't leave me. The trail narrowed again, and the trees closed in more tightly. I checked my watch. It was getting late. I had maybe another hour of daylight left, but the thought of turning back didn't sit well with me. I pressed on, despite the creeping sense of unease gnawing at me. I hadn't gone far before I came across another sign of something odd. This time, it was a large, jagged rock formation that seemed to rise out of the earth like a crooked spine. It looked like something out of a horror movie, the way the rock twisted and contorted. But the strangest part was the markings. Deep gouges in the surface, as though something had clawed at it. I stopped. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I bent down, inspecting the marks more closely. They were too symmetrical to be made by any animal I knew of. They were sharp, deliberate, as if something or someone had purposely carved them into the rock. I ran my hand over the surface, feeling the coolness of the stone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been here recently. I took a deep breath and stood up. It was probably nothing. The forest was wild. People came through here sometimes, leaving their mark. Still, I couldn't deny that the unease had settled deeper into my chest. I kept walking, telling myself that the trail would soon open up, that I was almost there. But as I moved forward, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The sounds of the forest had faded entirely now, and the wind had died down. The air felt thick and heavy, and every step I took felt like it was taking me farther from safety. It wasn't long before I realized that something was wrong. The trail had disappeared. It wasn't that it was overgrown. No, it was more like it had been deliberately obscured. The trees had closed in so tightly around me that it was hard to even see where the path had been. I pulled out my map, trying to reorient myself, but the lines blurred in my mind. I turned in a circle, trying to make sense of the situation. I had been careful to stay on course. Had I missed a turn? Had I wandered off the trail without noticing? I retraced my steps, but the forest seemed different now. The trees weren't just surrounding me. They were closing in, blocking out the light, making it harder to breathe. Every sound felt amplified, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I checked my phone. No signal. Panic began to claw at my insides. I wasn't lost. Couldn't be lost. I had always been careful when hiking, but the realization that I had no idea where I was struck me with a sharp, icy dread. My heart began to race, and I forced myself to stay calm. I took a few deep breaths and scanned the area for something familiar. There had to be something, some sign of the trail. I started walking again, trying to keep my bearings, but everything looked the same. Dense trees, thick underbrush, and that unsettling silence. I had no choice but to keep moving, hoping I would find my way back. But the more I walked, the more the landscape seemed to shift around me, like the forest was deliberately confusing me, bending reality in subtle ways. Then, just as the last traces of daylight were slipping away, I saw it, a flicker of movement in the distance. My heart leapt in my chest. Was it another hiker? I squinted through the trees, trying to make out the figure, but it was too far away. My instincts told me to call out, to approach, but something held me back. I didn't know what it was, but a gut feeling told me to stay quiet, to stay still. The figure disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared, vanishing into the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. What the hell was that? I knew I had to get out of the woods, fast. The darkness was creeping in, and I had no idea where I was. But I refused to panic. I had hiked enough to know that keeping a level head was key. I forced myself to focus, one step at a time. I kept moving, eyes scanning the trees, ears straining for any hint of sound. The woods were silent now, but I could feel the tension in the air, like the entire forest was watching, waiting for something to happen. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw it. A break in the trees, a sliver of moonlight cutting through the canopy. I moved toward it, faster now, not caring about the noise I was making. And then I broke through. The trees opened up, and I stumbled into a small clearing. It wasn't much, just a patch of grass with a few rocks scattered around. But it was enough. The sky above me was clear, the stars twinkling faintly. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to calm my racing heart. I had made it. It wasn't until I sat down on a rock, catching my breath, that I realized how close I had come to something truly dangerous. I had no idea what had been out there in the woods, what had been watching me, but I knew one thing for certain. I was never hiking this trail again. And from that moment on, I made a promise to myself that I would never take the woods for granted again. The wilderness, as beautiful as it was, held secrets I wasn't ready to understand. And sometimes, the only thing you can do is get out before it's too late. I found my way back to the trailhead by following the stream I had passed earlier, and by the time I reached my car, the night had fully settled in. I didn't look back. The air was crisp that morning, the kind that tingles your nose and reminds you of early autumn. I decided to hike up a trail I hadn't tried before, a lesser-known path nestled in the foothills about an hour outside of town. It wasn't in any guidebook, just something a coworker had mentioned offhand. Quiet and unmarked, he said, but the views at the top are unreal. I was itching for solitude and some exercise, so it seemed like the perfect way to spend my Saturday. The drive out was uneventful. Just me, my small backpack, and a couple of granola bars stuffed into the side pocket. I'd filled my hydration bladder to the brim, knowing the hike was about 7 miles round trip and the weather wasn't supposed to get above 65 degrees. Perfect hiking conditions, really. My boots, worn and reliable, sat on the passenger seat. I slipped them on when I reached the trailhead, or what passed for one. It wasn't much more than a narrow dirt path snaking into a cluster of trees. A faded, hand-painted sign leaned against a nearby fence post. It read, "Hunter's Hollow Trail." I'd done my fair share of hikes over the years, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to lean in over the trail, their branches forming a dense canopy. Or maybe it was the quiet. Even at the trailhead, there was none of the usual birdsong or rustling leaves. Just stillness, broken only by the crunch of gravel under my boots. The first mile was uneventful. The trail climbed gently, winding through the forest. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in thin, golden beams, and the earthy scent of moss and damp would fill the air. I fell into a rhythm quickly, my boots pressing soft indentations into the dirt. The silence was calming at first, almost meditative, but after a while it began to feel oppressive, like I was walking through a vacuum. By mile 2, the trail had become steeper and rockier. My legs burned pleasantly as I ascended, and I stopped to catch my breath near a small clearing. From there, I could see the valley below, a patchwork of green and brown stretching out toward the horizon. It was beautiful, but the stillness persisted. No wind, no chirping crickets, nothing, just silence. That's when I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they were mine, but the tread pattern was different. These were flatter, less defined, and much larger. Someone else had been up here recently, though the trail was so overgrown in places that it seemed unlikely. I crouched to get a better look. They weren't fresh, maybe a day or two old, but they followed the trail ahead. I stood up, brushing the dirt off my hands, and decided to keep going. The forest thickened as I climbed higher, the trees crowding closer together. The sunlight that had warmed my back earlier was now reduced to thin, grayish strips that barely illuminated the trail. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, an awareness of being alone, or maybe not. The rational part of me knew it was probably just the isolation messing with my senses. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Around mile 3, I came across an old campsite. A crumbling fire ring sat in the center, its stones blackened with soot. Nearby, a tattered sleeping bag lay half-buried in leaves. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but there was no mistaking the signs of human presence. Empty food wrappers, a rusted canteen, and a broken flashlight were scattered around the site. I nudged the sleeping bag with the tip of my boot, and a small cloud of mildew wafted up. Whoever had been here hadn't left in a hurry. They just disappeared. I lingered for a moment, my eyes scanning the surroundings, then pressed on. The trail grew narrower, the undergrowth thicker. Branches scraped against my sleeves, and the air felt colder the higher I climbed. The footprints reappeared sporadically, veering off the trail at odd angles before returning to it. They seemed more erratic now, like whoever made them had been wandering or lost. The turning point came just past the 4-mile mark. The trail opened onto a small ridge, and for the first time, I saw the summit ahead. It was a jagged outcrop of rock that jutted into the sky like a broken tooth. The path leading up to it was steep and uneven, littered with loose stones and fallen branches. I paused to take a sip of water, my eyes scanning the ridge for movement. That's when I noticed it, a faint trail of smoke curling upward from the summit. My pulse quickened. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. But who would be up here? The thought of company was both reassuring and unsettling. I hadn't seen a single soul all day, and the abandoned campsite suggested this trail wasn't exactly popular. Still, I decided to check it out. Better to know what I was dealing with than to turn back now and spend the rest of the hike wondering. The final stretch was brutal. The trail all but disappeared, forcing me to scramble over rocks and push through dense thickets. My hands were scratched and raw by the time I reached the summit, but the view was worth it. The valley spread out below like a living map, and the mountains in the distance looked close enough to touch. But the beauty of the scene was overshadowed by the source of the smoke. It wasn't a campfire. It was a small pile of smoldering debris, twigs, leaves, and what looked like strips of fabric. The fire had mostly burned out, leaving behind a circle of blackened earth. Nearby, a backpack lay propped against a boulder. It was newer than the one I'd seen at the abandoned campsite, and it looked recently used. The zippers were partially open, revealing a flashlight, a half-eaten energy bar, and a folded map. I called out, my voice echoing across the ridge. No answer. I tried again, louder this time, but the only response was the rustling of leaves in the breeze that had finally picked up. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Something wasn't right. The fire, the footprints, the abandoned campsite. It all added up to a picture I didn't want to piece together. I approached the backpack cautiously, my eyes darting to the surrounding trees. The map was marked with a series of X's, each one corresponding to a point along the trail I'd just hiked. The final X was right where I was standing. My hands shook as I folded the map and slipped it back into the pack. Whoever had marked this trail had planned to be here, and they weren't alone. A sudden noise broke the silence, a sharp crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. I whipped around, heart pounding. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the breeze. I scanned the ridge, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The trail back down stretched out behind me, dark and uninviting. I didn't wait to see what had made the noise. I grabbed my pack and started down, my legs moving faster than they should on such uneven terrain. The descent was a blur of panic and adrenaline. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, felt amplified, like the forest was alive and watching. I slipped twice, scraping my palms and tearing a hole in my pants, but I didn't stop. I just wanted to get back to my car, to the safety of civilization. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dirt lot. My car was the only one there, its red paint gleaming in the fading light. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. The forest was silent again, but this time, it felt less like peace and more like a warning. I never went back to Hunter's Hollow Trail. Weeks later, I read about a missing person, a hiker who'd vanished without a trace in the same area. The news didn't surprise me. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something I wanted to encounter again. Sometimes it's better not to know. The old cabin stood silently among the trees, shrouded in a dense fog that clung to the ground like a second skin. The air was damp and heavy, thick with the smell of wet pine and earth. I had come up here to get away from everything. Just me and nature, no distractions, no noise, no people. I thought it would be the perfect escape. I had been warned. The locals around the small town at the foot of the mountains had given me strange looks when I asked about the cabin. Some had even advised me to reconsider renting it, but I wasn't interested in their superstitions. I needed silence, and a cabin like this seemed like just the place to find it. The cabin was isolated, far from any roads or nearby houses, the kind of place you could only reach by foot or by driving along a narrow dirt path that seemed to disappear into the wilderness. The owner, an older man with a shaky voice, handed me the key and told me to be careful. I thought little of it. People are always warning you about things, especially when they don't want you to do something. When I arrived, the place was exactly as I expected. A small, single-story structure with a slanted roof and dark wood that looked aged but sturdy. The windows were grimy, and the door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled musty, like something had been sitting undisturbed for far too long. Dust covered the surfaces, and cobwebs clung to the corners. It wasn't unpleasant, though. Felt lived in, though long abandoned. I dropped my bags by the door and locked it behind me. The first night was peaceful. Too peaceful, maybe. The silence was so complete, it felt like the world outside had simply stopped existing. The only sound I could hear was the occasional rustling of the trees, but even that felt distant, muffled by the heavy fog that had settled in the valley. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin. The woods were dense, with thick underbrush and towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. It was beautiful in a way untouched by human hands. But as the hours passed, a strange feeling began to settle in my chest, something I couldn't explain. It was a weight, a pressure, as if the forest was watching me, waiting for me to leave or make a mistake. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, being alone in the wilderness for the first time can play tricks on your mind. That night, I built a fire in the cabin's small stone fireplace and settled in with a book. The crackling flames cast long shadows on the walls, and the warmth felt comforting. Then, as the night deepened, I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, a soft tapping. I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch tapping against the cabin. But then it came again, louder this time. The sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It wasn't wind, it wasn't a branch. It was something else. My heart started pounding, but I told myself it was just an animal outside, maybe a squirrel or a raccoon. The tapping continued, now accompanied by a low, grinding noise. I froze, listening. It was coming from the roof. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to check. But the curiosity gnawed at me, pulling me out of my chair and towards the door. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and hesitated, standing there in the quiet cabin, the tapping still echoing above me. I stepped outside onto the small porch, shining the beam of light up toward the roof. The flashlight flickered for a moment before settling on the wooden shingles, and I could see nothing. But the tapping didn't stop. It was louder now, as if something was moving across the roof, dragging its feet. I backed away from the porch, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, the weight of snow or ice shifting on the roof. But then, as I stood there, something caught my eye. A shape, dark and subtle, moved along the edge of the roof. A figure, small but distinct, crouched in the shadows, blending with the dark wood. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were frozen in place. My breath caught in my throat. For a long moment, the figure stayed still, almost like it was waiting for me to react. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished into the trees, disappearing into the fog without a sound. I stood there for a while, staring at the empty roof, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But there was no rational explanation. No wind, no animals, nothing that could explain it. My heart was racing. I wanted to go inside, lock the door, and never step foot outside again. But I didn't. I stood there, frozen, as the night seemed to grow colder and the air heavier. Eventually, I did go back inside, closing the door behind me with shaking hands. The tapping had stopped, but the feeling didn't leave. The sense that I wasn't alone, that something was still out there watching. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside made my pulse spike. I kept the flashlight on my bedstand, ready to shine it at the smallest noise. But nothing else happened. The rest of the night passed in a strange, uneasy silence. In the morning, I told myself it had just been my imagination. I'd been alone too long, my mind playing tricks on me. I decided to spend the next day exploring further into the woods, hoping to clear my head. I gathered my things, put on my jacket, and stepped outside. The fog had lifted somewhat, and the sun was beginning to peek through the trees. The forest seemed less oppressive, but the unease still lingered. I walked deeper into the woods, away from the cabin, until the trees grew thicker, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The silence was almost deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I stopped for a moment, trying to listen for any sound, but there was nothing, not even the birds. That's when I heard it again, the sound of something moving through the underbrush. It wasn't close, but it was definitely there, just beyond my vision. I turned quickly, but saw nothing, just the trees, the empty air. I wasn't sure how much longer I could take this. The isolation was starting to get to me. I needed to leave, but something told me I had to stay, that I hadn't found the answers yet. I made my way back to the cabin, my footsteps quick and uneven. As I approached the door, I noticed something strange. The doorknob was turned, slightly ajar. I hadn't left it like that. I knew I hadn't. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door. Something was wrong. But what? I pushed the door open slowly, my heart in my throat. Inside, everything seemed just as I had left it. The furniture, the fireplace, the shelves filled with old books. But there was a subtle change. The dust on the floor was disturbed, like someone had been walking around. Small footprints led from the door to the corner of the room, where a chair had been moved slightly out of place. I stepped inside, feeling the coldness of the room seep into my bones. I couldn't understand it. No one else had been there, or had they? Then, from behind me, I heard the sound of footsteps. Light, quick, but unmistakable. I spun around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. The door was still closed, the cabin still silent. The footsteps stopped. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things, bolted the door behind me, and ran into the woods. I didn't look back. My legs burned. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop. The fog was thick again, and the trees closed in around me, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. When I finally reached the small road that led back to town, I didn't feel relief. I felt numb. My hands trembled, and my body shook with exhaustion. I didn't stop until I was back in the town, sitting in my car, staring at the road ahead. What had happened in that cabin? What had I seen? What had I heard? The townspeople weren't surprised to see me back early. They simply nodded, their expressions unreadable. The owner of the cabin had left a note for me at the local inn, asking if I'd had a good stay. I never responded. Some things are better left unexplored. I don't know what it was that I felt in that cabin, or who or what had been watching me from the shadows. But I don't need to know, and I don't ever want to go back. Started as a day hike, something I'd done dozens of times before. I've always loved the solitude of the woods, the way the trees seem to close in around you, muffling the sounds of the outside world. That Saturday morning, I decided to explore a trail I'd heard about but never tried. It was supposed to lead to a secluded lake deep in the forest, untouched by crowds. Armed with a map I printed off the internet, a half-full water bottle, and a granola bar, I felt ready for an adventure. The first few miles were exactly what I had hoped for. Peaceful and quiet, with only the rustle of leaves and the distant chatter of birds keeping me company. The trail was narrow but well-marked, winding through tall pines and oaks, their branches forming a canopy overhead. Every so often, I'd catch glimpses of sunlight streaming through the gaps, dappling the ground in golden patches. The air smelled earthy and clean, a mix of damp soil and pine needles. I walked for what felt like hours, stopping occasionally to take in the beauty around me. At one point, I came across a small clearing where wildflowers bloomed in every color imaginable. Felt like stepping into a postcard. I remember thinking how lucky I was to be there, away from the noise and rush of daily life. But as the trail began to climb steeper and the trees grew denser, I noticed something strange. The path, once so clear, started to fade. The markers that had been nailed to trees every few hundred feet were suddenly nowhere to be seen. I paused, pulling out the map to check my bearings. According to it, the trail should have continued straight, but all I saw ahead was a tangle of undergrowth. I figured I must have missed a turn, so I backtracked a bit, scanning the trees for a marker. Nothing. Frustrated but not yet worried, I decided to push forward, hoping to pick up the trail again further ahead. The deeper I went, the less familiar everything looked. The trees seemed closer together now, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and fallen leaves that made every step feel precarious. After another hour of aimless wandering, I realized I was lost. The trail was gone, and so was my sense of direction. Panic started to creep in, a slow, insidious thing that tightened my chest and quickened my breath. I forced myself to stop and think. "Stay calm," I muttered under my breath. "You've got a map. You'll figure this out." But the map was useless without any landmarks to orient myself. The trees all looked the same, an endless sea of green and brown stretching in every direction. I decided to climb a small hill nearby, hoping to get a better view of the area. The ascent was harder than it looked, the loose soil and rocks slipping under my boots. When I finally reached the top, I scanned the horizon, hoping to spot something recognizable. A break in the trees, a distant road, anything. But all I saw were more trees, stretching out to the horizon in every direction. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows that made the forest feel even more oppressive. I knew I had to act fast. With no better option, I decided to follow the sun, reasoning that it would eventually lead me west, toward civilization. As I descended the hill, the forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing longer and darker with each passing minute. Walking became harder as the terrain grew rougher. The ground was littered with fallen branches and rocks hidden beneath layers of leaves. Every step felt like a gamble, and more than once, I stumbled, scraping my hands on the rough bark of nearby trees. My water bottle was almost empty, and my stomach growled in protest at the single granola bar I'd eaten hours ago. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. I hadn't planned to be out after dark and was dressed in light hiking clothes, not nearly enough to keep warm. The sounds of the forest changed too, the cheerful chirping of birds replaced by the eerie calls of owls and the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush. Every noise seemed amplified in the darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I found a spot beneath a large tree where the ground was relatively flat and decided to stop for the night. Sitting with my back against the trunk, I wrapped my arms around my knees, trying to conserve body heat. Sleep was out of the question. Every rustle and crackle in the dark sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I spent the night shivering and staring into the blackness, counting the hours until dawn. When the first light of morning filtered through the trees, I felt a surge of relief. Exhausted but determined, I set off again, sticking to a steady pace. My legs ached, and my throat was dry, but I pushed on, driven by the hope that I'd stumble across a road or a stream. By midday, that hope was beginning to fade. The forest seemed endless, and every direction felt like the wrong one. Then, I heard it, a faint, trickling sound that made my heart leap. Water. I followed the sound, stumbling through the underbrush until I came upon a narrow stream. Dropping to my knees, I drank greedily, not caring about the risk of bacteria or illness. The cold water was a lifesaver, refreshing me enough to think clearly again. I decided to follow the stream, reasoning that it would eventually lead to a larger body of water and, hopefully, signs of civilization. The going was slow, the uneven banks forcing me to climb over rocks and push through thick vegetation. But for the first time in what felt like days, I had a sense of direction. Hours later, just as the sun was beginning to set, I spotted something that stopped me in my tracks. A broken-down wooden bridge spanning the stream. It was old and rotted, but it was a sign of human presence. My heart raced as I crossed the bridge, ignoring the way it creaked ominously under my weight. On the other side, I found a narrow dirt path, overgrown but unmistakably man-made. I followed the path with renewed energy, my exhaustion forgotten in the rush of hope. It twisted and turned through the forest, and just when I began to fear it would lead nowhere, I saw it. A small cabin nestled among the trees. Smoke rose from its chimney, and the faint glow of a lantern shone through the window. Stumbling up to the door, I knocked weakly, barely able to stand. The door opened, and a man stepped out, his face a mix of surprise and concern. I didn't have the energy to explain much, just muttered something about being lost. He helped me inside, offering me water and a blanket as I collapsed into a chair. It turned out I'd wandered miles off the trail, deeper into the forest than I ever should have gone alone. The man, a local hunter, said he'd been staying in the cabin for a few days and was about to head back to town. He gave me a ride the next morning, and as we bumped along the dirt road in his truck, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. I'd made it out. The forest had tested me, pushed me to my limits, but I'd survived. And as much as I'd always loved the woods, I knew I'd never take their dangers lightly again. The first sign that something was wrong came on the second night. I was alone in a remote part of the forest, far from the usual campsites where people gather in groups, laughing and drinking around shared fires. This trip was supposed to be different. I wanted solitude. I wanted the silence of nature to wrap around me, giving me the clarity I hadn't felt in months. My job, my relationships, everything felt like it was closing in. So, I packed my gear, drove 6 hours out to the national forest, and hiked deep into the wilderness until I couldn't hear anything but the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. The first night was uneventful. I pitched my small tent by a stream, cooked a simple meal over my portable stove, and sat by a fire I'd built from collected wood. The sky was a canvas of stars, unpolluted by city lights, and I felt a rare sense of peace. The air was cool, crisp, and filled with the scent of pine. As the fire crackled, I thought about how much I needed this, the quiet, the disconnection. I fell asleep easily that night, lulled by the sounds of the forest. The second day, I explored further into the woods. I'd marked my campsite on a map and carried a GPS just in case. The forest was dense but beautiful, with towering trees that seemed ancient, their bark rough and scarred. I came across a few deer, who froze at the sight of me before darting off into the undergrowth. A hawk circled high above, its sharp cries echoing in the stillness. I felt small but in a good way, as if the world was reminding me of its vastness. By late afternoon, I returned to my campsite, tired but satisfied. I collected more firewood, boiled water from the stream, and prepared another simple meal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped, and the forest grew darker, the shadows stretching and merging into an inky blackness. The fire was my only source of light, casting flickering patterns on the surrounding trees. That's when I first felt it, a faint unease. At first, I dismissed it as my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone, and solitude can make the imagination run wild. But the feeling persisted. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the sensation of being watched. I told myself it was nothing, just the natural sounds of the forest. The crack of a branch could be a deer or a raccoon. The rustle of leaves could be the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. When I went to bed that night, the unease followed me. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening to the sounds outside. The stream gurgled softly, and occasionally, I heard the faint hoot of an owl. But there was something else, too. A faint rustling, irregular and deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It was too controlled, too purposeful. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a fox or a coyote, nothing to worry about, but I kept my knife within reach just in case. The third day started as usual. The unease of the night before seemed silly in the daylight. I chalked it up to my imagination and focused on enjoying the day. I hiked further into the forest, discovering a small waterfall that spilled into a clear pool. The sight was breathtaking, and I spent hours there, sketching the scene in a notebook I'd brought along. When I returned to my campsite that evening, something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. My gear was all where I'd left it. The fire pit was undisturbed, but there was a subtle difference, like the energy of the place had shifted. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper. I brushed it off and went about my routine, building a fire and preparing my meal. As the night wore on, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the dark trees for movement. The firelight didn't reach far, leaving most of the forest in shadow. I told myself I was being paranoid, but when I crawled into my tent that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the edge of the light. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had startled me. I lay still, listening. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. No wind, no insects, no distant hoots or calls. Just silence. Then I heard it. A faint crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate. It was close, too close. My heart pounded as I reached for my knife. I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out, but the darkness was impenetrable. The fire had burned down to embers, offering little light. The sound stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, the sound came again, this time on the other side of the tent. Whatever it was circling me. I gripped the knife tighter, my palms slick with sweat. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat there, knife in hand, waiting for the first light of dawn. When it finally came, the forest seemed to come alive again. Birds chirped, and the breeze rustled the leaves. But I couldn't shake the sense that something had been out there, watching me. I decided to cut my trip short. As much as I loved the solitude, this was too much. I packed up my gear quickly, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it felt stronger. The hike back to my car was uneventful at first. The forest was peaceful, and I started to feel silly for letting my imagination get the best of me. But as I got closer to the trailhead, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the trail, in the soft dirt, were footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. They were too large, and they weren't from a hiking boot. They looked like they belonged to someone wearing worn, flat-soled shoes. The prints followed the trail, sometimes veering off into the underbrush before returning. I realized with a sinking feeling that they matched my path. Whoever had made them had been following me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got to the trailhead, the fresher the prints seemed. It was as if whoever it was had been following me all morning. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the back and locked the doors. As I started the engine and drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, watching me until the forest disappeared in my rearview mirror. I reported the incident to the rangers when I reached the nearest town. They took my statement seriously but said there wasn't much they could do without more information. I left my contact details and drove home, the events of the trip replaying in my mind. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me. Maybe it was just another camper, curious about the stranger in their woods. Or maybe it was someone with darker intentions. I'll never know. What I do know is that I've never felt the same about being alone in the wilderness. The solitude I once craved now feels like a vulnerability, an open invitation to things unknown. And every time I step into the woods, I can't help but wonder if something is watching, just out of sight. It all started as a weekend getaway. The idea was simple: escape the noise of the city, spend a couple of nights in the wilderness, and come back feeling refreshed. I'd done it before and I knew the routine. Pack light but smart, carry enough food and water, and make sure to let someone know where you're going. This time, I picked a remote spot in a national forest about 3 hours from where I lived. It wasn't a well-known camping area, which was part of the appeal. No crowded trails or noisy groups, just me, the trees, and the sounds of nature. The drive out there was uneventful. I had my gear in the back of my SUV, a playlist of old rock songs keeping me company, and the kind of excitement that comes from knowing you're about to disconnect from everything. The roads got narrower the closer I got to the forest, eventually turning into a dirt path with potholes and overgrown bushes scraping the sides of the car. It wasn't anything I hadn't handled before, but it did remind me how isolated this spot was. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping low in the sky, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. I found a clearing about half a mile from the main trail. It was surrounded by tall pines, with a small stream nearby. Perfect. I parked the car, grabbed my backpack, and started setting up camp. The tent went up smoothly, and I had a small fire going just as the last bit of daylight faded. Dinner was a simple affair. A can of chili heated over the fire and a granola bar for dessert. I sat there for a while, staring into the flames and listening to the sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl. When I finally crawled into my tent, I felt that deep kind of peace that only comes when you're far away from everything. I drifted off to sleep easily, the cool night air and the soft sounds of the forest lulling me into a deep rest. The first night passed without incident. I woke up early, made myself some coffee, and spent the morning exploring the area around my camp. The forest was beautiful, with sunlight filtering through the trees and the air crisp and fresh. I followed the stream for a while, spotting a couple of deer in the distance and even a fox darting through the underbrush. By midday, I'd worked up an appetite and returned to camp for lunch. That's when I noticed something odd. My backpack, which I'd left inside the tent, was unzipped. At first, I thought I'd forgotten to close it, but as I checked my things, I realized some of my food was missing. It wasn't much, just a couple of energy bars and a small bag of trail mix, but it was strange. There were no signs of an animal getting into the tent, no rips or claw marks. It looked like someone had carefully unzipped it and taken the food. I shrugged it off. Maybe I'd been careless and left the tent open, and a raccoon or something had snuck in. I zipped everything up tightly this time and went about my day. The afternoon was uneventful. I read a book by the fire, took a short nap, and started preparing dinner as the sun began to set. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The forest felt different. The usual sounds were there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that the strange incident with the backpack had put me on edge. But every time I started to drift off, I'd hear a noise, a twig snapping, a rustle in the bushes, and my eyes would snap open. I stayed in my sleeping bag, straining my ears, but nothing ever came close to the tent. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found more signs that something wasn't right. The firewood I'd gathered the day before was scattered around the clearing, as if someone had kicked it. My water bottle, which I'd left by the fire pit, was gone. I searched the area but couldn't find it. It was unsettling, to say the least. I started to wonder if someone else was out here, messing with me. But why? This spot was so remote that the chances of running into another camper were slim. And even if someone else was out here, what kind of person sneaks into someone's camp just to take a water bottle and some snacks? I decided to pack up and leave. The trip wasn't worth the growing sense of unease. As I started breaking down my tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints in the dirt around the clearing. Not boot prints like you'd expect from a hiker, but bare footprints. They were faint, but they were definitely human. I wasn't alone out here. I hurried to get my gear into the car, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt oppressive now, the tall trees seeming to close in around me. As I loaded the last of my things, I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a growl, coming from the trees. It wasn't an animal. It was too deep, too deliberate. My hands shook as I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The drive back down the dirt road was nerve-wracking. I kept expecting something to step out from the trees or to see someone in my rearview mirror. But the road remained empty, and I finally made it to the highway. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. Looking back, I can't say for sure what happened out there. Maybe it was some kind of prank, or maybe someone really was living in those woods, taking what they needed from unsuspecting campers. Either way, it was enough to make me think twice about camping alone again. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. You never really know what's out there watching. I never thought it would happen to me. I had always been the kind of person who was prepared, who knew how to stay calm in a tough situation. But that morning, I found myself hopelessly lost in the middle of a dense forest. No idea how to get back, and every step I took seemed to make things worse. It started innocently enough. I had decided to take a solo hike in the woods near my cabin. The area wasn't unfamiliar to me. I'd hiked here a few times, enjoyed the solitude, the quiet, but that day something felt different. I wasn't sure if it was the weather, unusually overcast for this time of year, or if it was just the growing feeling that I should have stayed home, but I pushed it aside. I needed the fresh air, the escape. I parked my car near the trailhead and set out around 9 in the morning. The temperature was cool, but comfortable enough with a light jacket. The path was well worn at first, a clear trail marked with yellow blazes on the trees. I felt confident. There was a rustling in the trees above, and I could hear birds calling to each other as I walked along the trail, my boots crunching the dry leaves underfoot. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the peace, the stillness of the woods. I passed the first mile marker, then the second. By now, the trail was winding through thicker trees, and the usual path was becoming less clear. But I had my map and compass, so I wasn't too worried. I'd hiked in areas where the trail wasn't as defined. I had learned to rely on my instincts and keep my bearings. But as I glanced at the map, something seemed off. I couldn't quite place it, but I felt like I'd missed a turn somewhere. The markers on the trees had become sparse, and the path didn't seem to match up with what I remembered. Still, I pressed on. Another hour passed, and the atmosphere had shifted. The light filtering through the trees had dimmed, and the once lively sounds of birds and insects seemed to have faded into silence. My surroundings felt heavier, like the air itself was thickening. My stomach knotted as I tried to follow the path, but every way I looked seemed to blur into an endless sea of trees. I pulled out my compass again. It didn't seem to be helping much, nothing felt right. I took a deep breath and retraced my steps, trying to find a sign of the trail I might have missed. I had a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, something that told me I had wandered too far off course. After another half hour of walking, it became clear I wasn't just a little lost. I was completely off track. Panic set in, but I fought it back. I knew that wasn't going to help me. I needed to stay calm, think logically. I pulled out the map again, but it didn't make sense. The landmarks I was looking for weren't matching up with what I saw around me. The dense forest had started to feel like a maze. I'd been hiking for hours now, and every direction I turned felt the same. The woods stretched endlessly, trees and underbrush, the occasional rock or fallen log. Nothing else. I checked my phone, no signal. The battery was still half full, but that wasn't going to help me without a signal. I was on my own. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows through the trees. My anxiety spiked. I hadn't planned to be out here this long. I thought about making camp for the night, but I couldn't stop the creeping worry that something would go wrong if I didn't find my way out soon. I forced myself to stop and think. In situations like this, I knew the key was to make slow, deliberate decisions. But my heart was racing, and the thought of being stuck here overnight was too much to handle. The longer I stayed out here, the harder it would be to get back. I decided to keep walking in the direction I thought I'd come from. I wasn't sure anymore if I was retracing my steps or walking deeper into the wilderness. But I had to try. Hours passed. The forest felt even more alien now. The shadows were longer, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to stave off the chill that was settling in my bones. My mind started to wander. I thought about the things I'd left behind: my car, the cabin, the warmth of my bed. I regretted not telling anyone where I was going. I regretted not staying on the well-marked trail. But regret didn't do much for me now. Nightfall came quickly. The forest, once beautiful and tranquil, had become a hostile place. The sounds of the day had given way to eerie silence, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot or the rustle of leaves. Every time I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, I spun around, only to find nothing. It felt like the trees themselves were closing in on me, like the forest was swallowing me whole. I stumbled across a small clearing and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I was so tired. My legs ached, my stomach growled, and my thoughts were becoming muddled. I knew I needed to make a decision. Either I built a shelter and waited for daylight, or I kept moving. I didn't know which was the better choice, but I decided to press on. Just as I started to walk again, I saw a faint light in the distance. It wasn't bright, but it was unmistakable. A soft, warm glow flickered like a campfire. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Someone was out here. I pushed myself toward the light, faster than I should have. My heart was pounding now, the exhaustion almost unbearable, but the thought of human contact gave me new strength. The light grew larger as I got closer, until I could see the outlines of a campfire through the trees. When I finally reached the clearing, I stopped short. The campfire was real, but the scene before me wasn't what I expected. A man sat by the fire, hunched over, his back to me. The fire crackled, sending out bursts of warmth, but the man didn't move. I called out, but he didn't respond. I took a cautious step forward, but something made me hesitate. The firelight cast strange, flickering shadows on the trees, and it wasn't until I got closer that I saw what was wrong. The man wasn't alone. Around the fire were several packs, some open and spilling with supplies. But as I stepped closer, I noticed something that froze me in my tracks. The ground around the fire was marked with deep grooves, like something had been dragged through the dirt. I turned to leave, but my legs were stiff, my feet unwilling to move. A loud crack of a branch snapped through the silence, and I spun around. The man was still sitting by the fire, his back turned, but now I saw something else. A figure behind him, in the shadows, watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and I forced my legs to move, backing away slowly. My mind raced. I wasn't alone out here. The light, the fire, everything had been a trap. I hadn't been lost. I had walked right into something I couldn't understand. As I turned and ran, I heard the shuffle of footsteps behind me, then the unmistakable sound of someone or something breaking through the underbrush in pursuit. My heart thudded in my chest. Every breath felt sharp and desperate, but I didn't stop running. I had no idea how long I ran. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they might give out at any moment. But I kept going, driven by the terror that whatever had been waiting by the fire wasn't going to let me get away. Finally, when I thought I couldn't run another step, I stumbled into a small trail, narrow, but it was a trail, and it was something I recognized. I knew this path. I had walked it before. Without thinking, I sprinted down it, pushing myself forward. The sounds of pursuit faded as I ran, but I didn't dare look back. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the woods, the familiar clearing where I had started, that I finally stopped. I was out of breath, shaking uncontrollably, but I was safe. Looking back at the forest, I couldn't see any sign of the man or the fire. It was just the woods again, quiet, still, and dark. But I knew better than to trust it. I knew I had narrowly escaped something, and I wasn't going back. I made it to my car, and I drove straight home without stopping, never once looking in the rearview mirror. I didn't tell anyone what happened that night. No one would believe me anyway. They'd say I had gotten disoriented, that my mind had played tricks on me. But I know what I saw, and I will never step foot in those woods again. The day had started like any other. The sun was rising lazily over the hills, casting a soft golden light through the trees. I had been meaning to hike these woods for a while. They weren't too far from where I lived, just a quiet patch of nature with trails that went deep into the forest. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, mostly because it wasn't that serious. Just a morning hike to clear my head. I'd been walking for a while, nothing extraordinary, just the steady crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The air was thick with the smell of earth and pine, and the wind was gentle, more of a whisper than a breeze. The quiet was comforting, but a part of me felt a little uneasy. The woods felt different today, though I couldn't put my finger on why. I had started on a marked trail, but after a few miles, I began veering off the path. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, just a sudden urge to see what lay beyond the beaten track. The trees were thick and the light dimmed under their canopy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. I wasn't lost, not yet. I figured I could always retrace my steps if I needed to. The first sign that something was wrong came when I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in what felt like ages. I stopped and glanced around. Nothing. No sign of a trail, no markers on the trees, nothing to suggest I was going the right way. For a moment, I considered turning back, but I shrugged it off. There were enough landmarks, big rocks, fallen trees, that I could navigate without the markers. But then, it happened again. The trees seemed to change. It was subtle at first. The pine trees I had been walking through were replaced by something darker, taller. Oaks, I think. Their gnarled branches twisted against the sky, casting odd shadows on the forest floor. The air felt colder too, and I suddenly realized I hadn't seen a single animal since I'd gone off the trail. No birds, no squirrels, not even the rustle of insects. My stomach tightened, and a small knot formed in my chest. I pulled out my phone, but there was no service. Not surprising. The signal was usually weak in these parts, but I usually didn't need it. I'd gotten used to being out here alone, enjoying the silence. But today felt different. I pressed forward, telling myself it was just my imagination. The woods had a way of doing that, playing tricks on you. After what felt like another hour of walking, the landscape didn't look familiar. The trees were closing in on me, and the path had completely disappeared. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but nothing seemed right. There were no distinguishing features anymore. No rocks or fallen logs to mark where I had been. Just the endless stretch of the same dense trees. That's when the panic set in. I'd been walking for a long time now, and I wasn't sure where I was. The woods had turned darker, and the feeling of isolation hit me full force. The silence was suffocating. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive, as if the woods were closing in on me. I tried retracing my steps, but the trees all looked the same. I started walking faster, trying to calm my breath, trying to think logically. This wasn't the first time I had been lost. I had gotten turned around in the woods before, but I'd always found my way out. Always. The hours slipped by, and the sun began to dip lower in the sky. The woods felt colder, and I realized I should have packed more for the hike.
No jacket, no flashlight.
Just me, my phone, and a bottle of water that was now half empty. The idea of nightfall in the woods was starting to frighten me, but I didn't want to admit it. I just had to find a way out. I kept walking, faster now, each footstep seeming louder than the last, echoing in the emptiness. There was nothing but the sound of my own breath and the occasional crunch of leaves beneath my feet. Every now and then, I would stop, hoping to hear something, anything, something that would tell me I wasn't alone. But it never came. I stumbled over a rock, cursing under my breath. My ankle throbbed, and for a moment, I just sat on the ground, clutching it. My phone was still useless, the battery slowly draining. I tried again to make a call, but it was pointless. I had no idea how long I had been out here by the time I heard the sound. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder. A crackling sound, like twigs snapping underfoot. It wasn't an animal, though. No animal moved like that. The sound was too deliberate, too human. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, listening, my breath catching in my throat. The cracking of branches stopped, but I was sure I wasn't alone anymore. I looked around, but there was nothing, just the darkened forest. I wanted to scream, but I held it in. My brain was telling me to move, to run, to get away, but I couldn't seem to make my legs cooperate. Then, as suddenly as the noise had appeared, it was gone. For a few moments, all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. The silence felt heavier now. The woods weren't just silent. They were watching me. I stood up, my ankle still throbbing, and began walking again. This time, I made sure to keep my eyes open for any sign of civilization. A road, a building, anything that could lead me back. The fear was growing now, spreading like cold fingers down my spine. The trees around me seemed to close in tighter, blocking the path ahead. And then, finally, through the underbrush, I spotted something. A break in the trees, a small clearing. I rushed toward it, my pulse quickening. As I got closer, I could see it was just a small patch of land, no more than 20 feet wide. But in the center, there was something that made my heart skip. A cabin. It wasn't much. A rundown little shack with a sagging roof and peeling paint. But it was a cabin, and that meant people. That meant help. I approached cautiously, my legs unsteady beneath me. I reached for the door, hesitating for just a moment. It creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The air was musty, filled with the scent of old wood and dust. But it was safe. I was safe. I didn't know who had left this cabin here or why, but at that moment I didn't care. I locked the door behind me and sat down on the cold, dusty floor. My head was spinning, my breath shallow. I closed my eyes for just a moment, and when I opened them again, the light was fading outside. But I was no longer afraid. The cabin had given me something the woods couldn't, a sense of safety. I sat there for hours, just breathing. Eventually, the thought struck me. I was going to make it out of here, and it was going to be okay. Tomorrow, I would find my way back, find the trail. I would tell people about the woods, about the odd feeling, about the strange sounds. But none of that mattered right now, because for the first time all day, I felt calm. I was no longer lost. I'd been hiking for hours when the sun started to dip beneath the horizon. The warm, late afternoon light had turned into something more muted, more gray, and I had just realized I wasn't sure where I was. The trail I'd been following had split at some point, and I, in my usual overconfidence, chose to take the path less traveled. It was supposed to be a scenic detour, a quick jaunt through the woods to get away from the crowds, to find a peaceful spot for some quiet reflection. I'd never expected to end up lost. The first few signs weren't alarming, just a misturn, a slight change in the underbrush that didn't feel familiar. But soon, those small shifts turned into something larger. The trees grew denser, the trail harder to follow, and the sounds of the forest seemed to close in on me. I checked my phone an hour ago, but the signal was weak. I tried again, hoping for a miracle, but it was hopeless. I had no GPS, no map, and no way to figure out where I was. The temperature had started to drop, the air feeling heavier, colder. I wrapped my jacket tighter around my shoulders, trying to hold on to the last remnants of warmth. The trail had been so clear when I began, but now it felt like it was disappearing under my feet. The dirt path had given way to uneven ground, rocks jutting out from the earth like teeth, and fallen branches that made every step a bit more dangerous. I knew I should have turned around hours ago, but my stubbornness kept me pushing forward. Couldn't give up. Not now. With each step, the woods grew darker. The trees seemed to close in around me, blocking out what little light was left from the sky. The wind had picked up, rustling through the canopy overhead, sending leaves scattering across the path. The rustling felt almost unnerving, like something was moving with me, just out of sight. I stopped, trying to listen. It was hard to distinguish the natural sounds of the forest from the whispers in my own head. A distant bird call, the snap of a twig somewhere off to my left. The sounds seemed too deliberate, too loud, too close. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just an animal, a deer or something small, maybe a squirrel. But as the minutes stretched on, I couldn't ignore the creeping feeling of being watched. I pulled out my phone once more, praying for a signal, any signal. The screen was blank, no bars, no Wi-Fi, nothing. Just the same empty, hopeless emptiness. I tucked it back into my pocket and kept moving. It wasn't long before I realized that the world around me had changed. The woods, which had once seemed welcoming and serene, now felt menacing. The shadows of the trees were deep, too deep, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. There was no trail anymore, just a series of scattered footprints, mine, I guessed, but they didn't seem to lead anywhere. The trees loomed over me like silent watchers, their twisted branches gnarled and reaching out, trying to pull me deeper into the unknown. I had to find a way out. The darkness grew quickly. My breath came in shallow gasps, not from exertion, but from the growing panic gnawing at my insides. The forest wasn't just a backdrop anymore. It was alive. It was closing in. I could hear the soft crunch of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, like someone or something was following me, waiting for me to slip up. My heart raced. There was no time to be afraid. I pushed forward, scanning the ground for some sign of a path, a marker, anything to tell me where I was. But there was nothing. Only trees, rocks, and the sound of my own footsteps. I stumbled over a root, catching myself on a tree trunk before I hit the ground. The thud of my body against the bark rang out in the quiet, and I froze. The noise seemed to echo unnaturally, stretching out, reverberating through the woods like a warning. The chill in the air was sharper now, and I could see my breath in the fading light. The wind howled above me, But on the ground, everything felt still. Too still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was close now, something moving just out of sight. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Every rustling leaf set my heart pounding. I wanted to scream, but I didn't know why. I didn't know who or what I was screaming for. The trees had grown so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead of me. The forest had swallowed me whole, and I felt like I was walking through a maze with no way out. The darkness was closing in, the night creeping through the cracks between the trees, and the air seemed to press down on me with increasing weight. I kept walking. I had to. My mind raced with thoughts of what might happen if I stopped. If I sat down and gave up, would I just disappear, lost to the woods forever? Would I be one of those stories, one of those cautionary tales they tell around campfires? Or worse, would I become a part of the woods, just another shadow that wandered aimlessly, forgotten by time? I tripped again, this time falling hard on my hands and knees. My palms scraped against the rough ground, and I gasped in pain, but there was no time to think about that. I pushed myself up, wiping the dirt from my hands. The wind was picking up now, howling through the trees, carrying with it the scent of wet leaves and something else, something almost metallic. My head swam as I stood there, trying to steady myself, trying to clear my thoughts. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I started moving again, it was with a renewed sense of urgency. I couldn't afford to waste any more time. The more I walked, the more the woods seemed to twist around me, the path growing more and more indistinct. What had once felt like a simple detour now felt like an endless labyrinth, a maze of trees with no way out. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it, clearing, a small patch of grass, a break in the trees. I could see the sky again, the first stars poking through the darkening night. I felt my heart leap in my chest, a surge of hope flooding through me. This was it. This had to be it. I sprinted forward, breaking through the last line of trees, and there it was, a road. A real road, a paved one with headlights approaching in the distance. Relief flooded through me, and I collapsed to my knees, unable to stop the tears that welled up in my eyes. I had made it. I was free. The woods hadn't swallowed me. I hadn't become just another lost soul. A car pulled up beside me, the headlights blinding for a moment before the driver's window rolled down. A man, looking concerned but friendly, leaned out. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, barely able to speak. All I could do was point to the woods behind me, where the trees stood silent and still. The man didn't seem to need any further explanation. He reached over, opened the passenger door, and I climbed in. As the car pulled away from the woods, I glanced back. The trees were just trees. The shadows were just shadows. And I was just me, no longer lost, no longer afraid. Just home. I woke up to a thick fog hanging low over the ground, a fog that seemed to swallow up everything in its path. The trees around me were nothing but silhouettes, their outlines barely visible through the mist. I had no idea how I'd gotten here, no memory of the hike, the path, or even when I last checked my phone for the time. It was just me and the fog, the cold and damp air, and a growing sense of dread. I took a deep breath, hoping the fog might lift soon, but the chill in the air seemed to only make it worse. My shoes squelched against the muddy earth as I tried to stand up, my legs stiff from whatever sleep or unconsciousness had held me. The ground was wet beneath me, and I looked around, trying to piece together what was happening. How had I ended up here? The last thing I remembered was the trailhead at the edge of the forest. I'd come out here to get some fresh air, away from the city and all its noise. I'd planned on following a well-marked path, the kind that would loop back to where I started after a few hours. I'd read about the trail online. Perfect for beginners, they'd said. Simple, beautiful views. they'd promised. I had no reason to believe anything could go wrong. But now, I had no idea which way to go. I glanced around the forest, the trees just barely visible through the thick mist. There was a faint path leading off into the woods in front of me, but the ground was so slick that my first few steps nearly made me slip. I wiped the mud off my pants and steadied myself before walking slowly forward. The mist was oppressive. Every few steps I'd expect the fog to clear, but instead, it felt like it just grew thicker, pressing down on me. My breath came out in short bursts, forming little clouds of white vapor in the air. The air was too cold for comfort, but my jacket wasn't much protection. I hadn't dressed for a trip this long. I checked my watch. The time seemed off, like it wasn't moving, or maybe it was just the panic setting in. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't packed enough food for an extended journey. I'd planned to be back by noon, but now the sun had shifted. How long had I been out here? I had no idea. I tried to calm myself down. There were always people on these trails, right? There had to be. I kept telling myself that I was fine, that I could just walk back and everything would be okay. But the longer I walked, the more I doubted that idea. I'd expected the trail to be straight and easy to follow. But as I looked around, the trees looked all the same, tall, dark, and unchanging. Every direction seemed identical. Nothing looked familiar. I pulled out my phone, trying to check for a signal, but it was dead. I cursed under my breath and shoved it back into my pocket. I walked for what felt like hours, but time had become irrelevant. My legs burned, my feet were sore, and my head was starting to ache. Every time I looked around, the fog seemed to be swallowing the trees whole, turning everything into one gray blur. The path, if there even was one anymore, was hard to see. It could have easily been an animal trail or nothing at all. I stopped for a moment, my heart pounding, a lump in my throat. I needed to find something, anything, a marker, a sign, anything that could tell me where I was. There had to be something. I wasn't completely lost. I refused to believe it. In the distance, I thought I saw something, a dark figure. Maybe it was a person, or another tree. My mind played tricks on me. I took a step closer, squinting through the mist. It was nothing, just another patch of trees, their gnarled branches twisting toward the sky. Nothing more. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I couldn't afford to waste time. The cold was biting, and the fog didn't seem to be lifting. I was getting dizzy now. The hunger, the tiredness, the overwhelming sense of confusion. It was all adding up. Another hour passed, maybe more. I could no longer tell. The daylight was dimming, the thick fog making it impossible to gauge how much time had passed. The trees around me seemed to close in, and I could feel the weight of the woods pressing against me. My legs were giving out, my muscles weak and trembling. I found myself leaning against a tree for support, my breath coming fast and shallow. There was no clear path ahead, no sign of civilization. I thought of my family, of my friends, of how this could turn into a nightmare if I didn't find a way out. They wouldn't even know where to start looking for me. Then, just as panic began to rise in my chest, I saw it. A small clearing ahead. There were fewer trees, and I could see a little light breaking through the fog. For the first time in hours, I felt a glimmer of hope. I pushed forward, each step feeling heavier than the last, but I couldn't stop now. I had to get out. I needed to get out. I stumbled into the clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the middle of the open space, was a small wooden structure. Cabin of sorts. It wasn't much, just a small shack, its wood weathered and covered in patches of moss. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see the faintest light. I didn't know what possessed me to approach it. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe the desperate need to find some kind of answer. I walked slowly toward the door, my heart racing. When I pushed it open, The creak of the old wood echoed in the silence. Inside was bare, no furniture, no signs of life. It was empty except for a few old crates stacked against one wall. It wasn't a home, not in the traditional sense, but it was shelter. And at that moment, shelter was all I cared about. I sat down against the wall, my legs too tired to support me any longer. My body felt like it was shutting down, but I couldn't stop my mind from racing. How had I ended up here? How could I have wandered so far off the trail? I tried to gather my thoughts, but the fog in my head wouldn't clear. My stomach growled again, but there was nothing to eat. I couldn't stay here. I knew that. The cold would soon become unbearable, and who knew how long this fog would last. Suddenly, I heard a noise outside, a soft crackle of footsteps. My heart skipped. Was someone else out there? I hadn't seen anyone since the trail. I stood up slowly, trying to remain as quiet as possible, listening carefully. The footsteps got closer, but there was no voice, no sounds of conversation. I moved toward the door, peering out carefully. A figure appeared through the fog. A man, wearing a dark coat, his features hard to distinguish in the mist. He was walking with purpose, but didn't seem to notice me. I watched him for a moment, debating whether to call out or stay hidden. But then, something unexpected happened. The man stopped and turned, as if sensing my presence. Our eyes met for a brief second. "Lost?" he asked, his voice rough but calm. I nodded, too exhausted to speak. "Follow me. I know the way out." I didn't hesitate. With relief flooding my chest, I followed him as he led me through the woods, the fog still thick but no longer suffocating. His pace was steady, and despite the exhaustion in my body, I felt the tiniest spark of hope returning. He seemed to know where he was going. Maybe he had been here before. Maybe he was one of those rare people who could navigate these woods with ease. After what felt like an eternity, the fog began to lift, and the trees started to thin. The trail ahead became clearer, and I recognized the familiar path I had been on earlier. The man stopped and turned to me, his face still obscured by the mist. "You're almost there," he said simply. "It's not far." And then, without another word, he walked off, disappearing into the woods, leaving me with nothing but the sound of my own footsteps as I made my way back to safety. I wasn't supposed to be out here. I knew that even as I trudged through the thick underbrush, my legs aching and my feet covered in scratches. The woods looked different now that the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The shadows stretched long and thin, and the air had that cold, crisp feel to it, like the kind of evening where you start second-guessing everything. I should have turned back hours ago, but I didn't. I was too stubborn for that. I had made the mistake of following that trail, convinced I could navigate it back to the main path. A small hike, just an hour or so out, I told myself, no big deal. But as the minutes stretched on, I realized how far off I'd gone, how the trees had become denser and the ground uneven. It all started when I noticed the path wasn't as clear anymore. The trail markers were few and far between, and the small, worn trail I'd been walking on was becoming harder to follow. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured I'd just take a few more steps, and I'd find my bearings. But the longer I went, the more lost I felt. There was nothing but trees, rows of tall, spindly trunks that looked like they went on forever. The ground beneath my boots was uneven, the roots crisscrossing like a tangled mess of veins, and the leaves, thick and damp from the recent rain, made it hard to get a good footing. I tried to backtrack, but the forest had already swallowed up my footsteps. The air was still, almost unnervingly so. I couldn't hear anything. No birds, no wind, no sound at all except for the pounding of my heart in my ears. I kept walking, telling myself that I could figure this out. I had a phone in my pocket, and I'd seen the map before I started. The idea of being lost didn't seem real to me then. But now, the quiet weighed on me, and the farther I went, the more that dread settled deep in my stomach. The branches above creaked, and I froze. I wasn't sure what I'd heard, but something made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I could feel the weight of the woods pressing in on me. The trees were so close together now, the spaces between them narrow, and the canopy above had thickened to the point where hardly any light filtered through. Felt wrong. I checked my phone, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but the screen was blank. No signal. Of course, I should have known better than to rely on it. I had a compass in my pack, though. Still, it wasn't much help when the world around me looked like an endless sea of green. Minutes turned to hours. I hadn't planned to stay out this long, but there I was. The sun was almost completely gone, and the sky was a dull, deep blue, the kind that made everything look like a shadow. I tried to steady my breathing to keep myself calm. I wasn't panicking. I told myself that, but the trees around me, they seemed taller, more imposing now, like they were watching me. The path, if you could even call it a path, had all but disappeared. I checked my watch. It was nearly 7 p.m. I should have been back by now. I knew the smart thing would be to stop and stay put until morning. But something inside of me kept pushing forward, as though I might stumble across the trail any second now. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard something. A snap, far off in the distance. I stopped dead in my tracks, holding my breath. My first thought was that it was an animal, a deer maybe, or even a bear. I had read that bears were active at this time of year, and I had heard the stories, how they were territorial, how they might come closer to human areas during certain seasons. But this, it didn't feel like an animal. It didn't feel like anything natural. The snap came again, closer this time. Too close. My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to turn and run, but I stood frozen, listening. There was no rustling of leaves, no movement from the forest floor, just that eerie, sharp crack of a branch breaking. My mind raced. Who else could be out here? I took a slow step backward, trying to make no noise, my breath shallow. It was then that I realized how silent the forest had become. Everything had stopped. Not a bird, not a breeze. It was just me and the unsettling crackling of the branches in the distance. I had to get out. I had to find the path. I stumbled forward, heart pounding. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves seemed louder now, like the entire forest was alive and aware of me. I had never felt so small, so exposed. I told myself not to look back, but the urge was unbearable. I had to know if I was being followed, or if it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I turned my head just for a second, and that was when I saw it. In the far distance, between two massive trees, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe another hiker, someone who had gotten lost too. But as I stared, I saw the truth. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, half hidden in the shadow of the trees. And it wasn't human. It was too tall, too still. My blood ran cold. I turned away quickly, my feet slipping on the wet ground as I tried to scramble in the opposite direction. My head was spinning. I needed to get out, but the trees felt like they were closing in on me, the path I was following becoming more and more indistinct. I was lost, completely, utterly lost. Minutes, maybe hours, passed, but I didn't know how long I had been walking. The sky was dark now, and the air had turned colder. My hands were numb, my legs were stiff, and I was beginning to feel dizzy. I wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion or the fear, but I had started to hallucinate. In the corner of my eye, I saw the figure again. This time, it wasn't far away, not in the distance. It was right there between two trees, standing motionless. I gasped, stumbling back, but I refused to look again. Couldn't. My breath was ragged, and I pushed myself faster through the woods, hands shaking as I gripped the branches around me, pushing through the underbrush. I needed to get out, but where was the way? Then, in the distance, I saw something, a clearing, a real open space. There was light, not much, but enough to make me feel like I wasn't completely losing my mind. I bolted toward it, the last reserves of my energy fueling me forward. I stepped out into the clearing, and there it was, the road, the main road. A trailhead sign was just a few yards away, half hidden in the overgrowth. The relief was so overwhelming that I almost collapsed. I was shaking, covered in dirt, branches tangled in my hair, but I had made it. I looked back toward the woods, that dense, endless thicket of trees that had felt like it was closing in on me. But now it was just quiet, peaceful even. There was no sign of the figure, no snap of branches. Just the familiar sight of the woods behind me, harmless now. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my frantic breathing. I wasn't sure what had happened in those woods. What I'd seen, what I'd heard. It didn't make sense. Maybe it was exhaustion or the isolation, but there was no denying that I had been scared out of my mind. I didn't know if I'd ever return to those woods again, but for now I was safe. The trees were behind me, and I could finally breathe. I never thought I'd get lost in the woods. It sounds ridiculous, right? But there I was, in the middle of a forest I'd hiked through dozens of times before, completely turned around and unsure of which direction to go. It started out as a simple afternoon hike. I've always been an outdoorsy person, the kind who knows the trails, the landmarks, the difference between poison ivy and regular plants, and the sounds of the forest. I knew the woods like the back of my hand. It was supposed to be just a short hike, a little break from work. I had taken a different path this time, just to see something new. There was a small creek I'd been meaning to check out, and I figured it would be a nice detour. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot, with a slight breeze that made the leaves rustle in the trees. The kind of day you'd want to spend outside. I followed the creek for a while, enjoying the sound of water bubbling over rocks. It was peaceful. I took a few pictures, sent them to a friend, and then kept walking. The trail wasn't marked very well, but I didn't mind. I'd been off the beaten path before. I knew how to read the land, but after a while, the creek started to widen, and the trees grew denser. The sounds of the forest shifted too, the chirping of birds fading into a silence I wasn't used to. I stopped for a moment and looked around. Something about the trees seemed different, and the air felt colder. I couldn't put my finger on it, but a small knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I looked back the way I came and realized that I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. I figured I'd just missed it, so I turned back and retraced my steps. But that's when I realized something wasn't right. The trees were all starting to look the same. The path I had walked was gone, as if it had never existed. I walked a little further, but it felt like I was just walking in circles. The sun was still up, but the light seemed dimmer now, like it was struggling to break through the thick canopy of leaves above. I stopped again and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I wasn't panicking yet, but the air felt too still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I knew there were no bears around here. This part of the woods wasn't known for them, but something about the silence made me feel like I was being watched. I pulled out my phone to check the map, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. That always happened in these areas. The battery was at 40%, but I knew better than to rely on it. I shoved it back in my pocket and kept walking, trying to think of anything that might help me find my way back. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and I knew I had to get out of here before it got dark. It wasn't a dangerous forest, but even familiar places change after nightfall. I started walking faster, my footsteps crunching on the forest floor, the sound of my breath filling the otherwise quiet air. Then I heard something. It was faint, like a soft crackling sound. At first, I thought it might have been an animal or maybe just the wind, but when I stopped and listened, I realized it was too consistent to be nature. It was something moving. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I moved quickly in the opposite direction, my heart beginning to race. The sound kept following me, always just behind me, as if whatever it was mimicking my steps. I didn't dare turn around. I kept walking and walking. Every direction I looked, it felt like the forest was closing in on me, each tree looking like a wall, trapping me in. My thoughts raced, trying to come up with a plan. But the longer I was in the woods, the less sense everything made. Then, I spotted a faint light in the distance, just a glow through the trees. For a moment, I thought it was an illusion, but I decided to make my way toward it. It had to be something, maybe a ranger station, or even another hiker. Anything to break the eerie silence that had been suffocating me. I pushed through the underbrush, the light getting brighter the closer I got. The glow wasn't a campfire or a lantern, though. It was just a soft, unnatural light, like the reflection of sunlight on the leaves, but it wasn't coming from the sun. My gut told me to turn back, but I was desperate. I broke through the trees into a small clearing, and there it was, a structure, a cabin, a small, dilapidated building with broken windows and a door that hung off its hinges. The light came from within, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin looked abandoned, decades, maybe even longer, of wear and neglect, but the light was unmistakable. It was coming from inside. I should have turned around then, but curiosity got the best of me. I approached the cabin slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. There was no one there. The inside of the cabin was dusty and empty, the floor covered in layers of grime. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the air smelled stale. But that light, it was brighter now, coming from the far corner of the room. As I stepped closer, I saw a small object on the floor, glowing faintly. It was a lantern. I reached down, my fingers trembling, and picked it up. The glow was coming from the glass itself, but the inside of the lantern was completely empty. There was no flame, no light source. I don't know why I didn't drop it immediately. Maybe I was too tired, or maybe the weirdness of the whole situation was starting to feel normal. But that's when I heard it. The sound again. Crackle. A step. A soft breathing. I spun around. The door slammed shut behind me. The room was pitch black for a moment. Then the lantern flickered back to life. But this time, it wasn't just glowing. It was lighting up the entire cabin. I stood there, frozen. I wasn't alone. There was someone standing in the far corner of the cabin, their back to me. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark, hunched figure. I had to get out of there. I had to. I ran to the door, the lantern lighting my way, and slammed it open. The figure didn't move. I didn't stop to look back. I sprinted through the woods, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The trees blurred around me, the ground uneven under my feet. I had no idea where I was anymore, but I kept going. The forest didn't feel like the same place anymore. It was alien, shifting, moving with every step I took. The air felt thick and heavy, almost suffocating, and every rustle in the underbrush sent a shock of fear down my spine. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, I broke through the trees. I stumbled out into an open field, the light of the setting sun finally breaking through the thick canopy above. I wasn't far from a road, and I could see a car parked in the distance. The relief I felt in that moment was indescribable. I kept running, not caring how tired I was, and made it to the road. I stopped, panting, my eyes scanning the area. I didn't see anyone else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I made my way to the nearest town after that, eventually finding a ranger station and telling them what had happened. They didn't believe me at first. Of course they didn't. But after some digging, They confirmed there was an old, long-forgotten cabin in those woods, one that had been abandoned for decades. They never found anyone in the woods, but I knew what I saw, what I heard, and I don't think I'll ever step foot in those woods again. I'm not sure what it was. A trick of the mind, maybe, some kind of mirage. But whatever it was, I'll never forget it, and I don't think I'll ever truly escape it. Started out like any normal weekend. I decided to go for a hike. Nothing special, just a long walk to clear my head. Lately, life had been feeling heavy, and the weight of everything was pressing down on me. Work was stressful, relationships complicated, and I needed a break. The woods were always my escape. Quiet, peaceful. A place where I could just breathe and forget everything for a while. The trail I took wasn't anything difficult. It was a loop, and I had hiked it dozens of times. I knew the area well enough that I didn't bother to take a map or my phone. My backpack was light. Some water, a snack, and my jacket just in case it got cold later on. The weather was perfect. Clear skies and cool air that was neither too hot nor too cold. I started down the familiar path, the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots the only sound. The trees around me were tall and dense, their branches thick with leaves that blocked out much of the sunlight. The forest smelled like earth and pine, fresh and alive. The air was crisp, and I felt a sense of calm that only the woods could bring. I had been walking for about an hour when I noticed something odd. There was a branch on the trail, freshly broken, lying across my path. It wasn't there when I passed it before. My first thought was that it was just the wind, but something about it felt wrong. The break was clean, as though it had been snapped in half by something or someone. I shrugged it off, deciding it wasn't worth worrying about. The woods had always been full of odd little details that didn't mean much. As I continued on, the trail started to narrow, the trees closing in around me. The further I went, the quieter it became. The birds had stopped chirping, and the rustling of the leaves seemed distant, like I was hearing it from a long way off. I could feel a faint unease creeping in, but I ignored it. I was fine. It was just the isolation, I told myself. It always felt a little odd when you were out there alone. The path twisted and turned, and I found myself veering off the main trail. I hadn't meant to, but somehow I ended up somewhere unfamiliar. The trees were thicker here, their trunks wider and their roots twisting up from the ground like fingers trying to grasp at the sky. The air felt heavier now, more still. I should have turned around, but I kept going. I told myself I was just being paranoid, and the new route would eventually loop back to the main trail. An hour passed, maybe more. Couldn't be sure. I hadn't checked my watch since the beginning. The woods had taken on a different feeling now. The silence was oppressive. There was no wind, no birds, no sounds of any kind. It was like the world had stopped. My footsteps sounded too loud in the stillness, the crunch of the leaves unnervingly sharp. It wasn't long before I realized I was lost. The trees all looked the same, and I couldn't remember how far I had walked or where I had veered off the trail. I looked around, trying to find a landmark, but there was nothing, just endless rows of trees. I started to feel the panic creeping in, my heart rate picking up, but I tried to remain calm. I was still in the woods I knew well. I had to just retrace my steps, right? But as I turned around, everything looked unfamiliar. The path I had taken was no longer there. There were no distinct features, no fallen branches, no rocks, no clearing where I had rested for a moment. Just endless trees. I checked my watch. An hour had passed since I had last looked at it. I had walked in a circle, but nothing around me felt familiar. Panic started to rise in my chest. I tried calling out, just to hear my own voice, but the sound was swallowed by the forest, leaving nothing but a deep silence. My throat tightened. I tried to stay calm. The worst thing I could do was panic. I took a deep breath and looked for any sign of a trail, any clue that would tell me which direction to go. But there was nothing. The forest stretched on in all directions, the trees so close together I couldn't see more than a few yards ahead of me. I started walking again, hoping to find something, anything, that might lead me out. The further I went, the more my steps seemed to drag. My legs felt heavier with each step, the exhaustion creeping up on me. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows that made the woods feel even more oppressive. I needed to find my way back soon, or I'd be stuck here after dark. The idea of being lost at night in these woods was terrifying. There was no cell service, no one would be able to hear me if I called out. The darkness here was thick, suffocating. And then I heard something. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. A snap of a branch behind me. I froze, my heart thumping in my chest. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too loud. Someone was out there. I turned, my eyes scanning the trees. But there was nothing. No one. Just the dense forest. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe I was imagining it. But the sound came again. This time, closer. I quickly spun around, but the woods were still empty. There was no one. I started walking faster, my breath coming faster, my pulse racing. I needed to get out of there, and fast. The sun was setting now, and the shadows had grown long and eerie. The air was colder, and I could feel the chill creeping into my bones. I stumbled through the woods, not caring about the direction anymore. I just needed to find my way out. The trees seemed to close in on me, the path more and more difficult to follow. My feet were sore from walking so much, and I had no idea where I was going. I was disoriented, exhausted, and scared. Every little noise made me jump. The snapping of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the call of a distant bird. All of it set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The woods were no longer just an escape. They were a trap. I was alone, lost, and the daylight was slipping away fast. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it, a break in the trees. It wasn't much, just a small gap in the dense forest, but it was enough. I ran toward it, my legs burning with exhaustion. As I pushed through the underbrush, I stumbled out into a small clearing, and there, at the edge, was the trail. It was faint but real, the trail I had been looking for. I sank to my knees, relief flooding through me like a wave. I had made it. I was going to get out of here. I never should have gone off the trail. It wasn't even that deep into the woods, just a couple of miles off a beaten path I'd walked dozens of times before. But that day I made a wrong turn. Or maybe I just thought I could take a shortcut. Either way, it wasn't long before the trees closed in around me, and I couldn't see the trail anymore. It's easy to get lost in the woods, and once you're lost, everything changes. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it got. I mean, it was still early afternoon, so there should have been the usual sounds. The rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, maybe the wind whispering through the branches. But none of that, just dead silence. I thought it was strange at first, but I shrugged it off. I figured I must have wandered farther than I realized. Maybe the sound of the wind through the trees just wasn't reaching me. But even as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The more I walked, the more I realized I couldn't find anything familiar. The trees, thick and twisted, seemed to stretch on forever, their bark dark and damp with the remnants of last night's rain. The path had disappeared completely, and I was left with nothing but the undergrowth and the feeling of being watched. That's when I noticed it, how still everything was. Not just quiet, but unnervingly still. No bugs, no animals. Not a single leaf moved in the breeze. I checked my phone. No signal. Of course, I had forgotten to download a map of the area. I always did that. I'd been here enough times to think I knew it like the back of my hand. But now I had no idea where I was. Panic crept in then. I shouldn't have gotten off the path. I shouldn't have thought I could just walk around, take a different route. But the worst part was how far the woods seemed to stretch. I didn't even know which direction I had come from anymore. I wasn't sure where I had been or where I was going. The trees were so dense, so alike. I couldn't remember if I'd passed that rock formation before or if the clearing up ahead was a new one. I took a breath, tried to calm myself. I needed to stay focused. I had to find my way out. Couldn't be that hard. Just follow the way I came, retrace my steps, and I'd find the path again. But as I walked, it became clear that my footsteps weren't leading me anywhere familiar. I tried not to panic. It wasn't like I had gotten completely lost, right? I could still find my way. I could turn around, retrace my steps. But each turn I made seemed to bring me deeper into the woods. The trees became thicker, the underbrush more tangled. My feet kept slipping in the wet leaves. I could feel the sweat gathering at the back of my neck, even though it wasn't that hot outside. Hours passed. At least I think they did. Couldn't be sure. I didn't have a watch and my phone was dead by then. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. I had no choice but to keep moving. The woods weren't forgiving after dark. The further I went, the more disorienting it became. Every turn felt like it led to the same place, or worse, a place I didn't recognize. The trees were too tall, the branches too tangled. I had no reference points, nothing familiar to anchor me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't tell if it was because I was afraid or because I was running low on energy. My legs were starting to ache, my stomach growling. I hadn't eaten since breakfast, and I had no water with me. My throat was dry, and every time I swallowed, it felt like I was swallowing sand. And then, when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard it. A crack, a twig snapping. I froze, holding my breath. My heart skipped a beat. My mind raced. Was it an animal? Person? The silence was suffocating. It had been so quiet all this time, but now something was breaking it. I strained my ears, but I couldn't hear anything more.
No rustling.
No more snapping twigs. The woods were as still as they had been before. I couldn't tell if I had just imagined it, or maybe I had been in this forest so long that my mind was starting to play tricks on me. I kept moving, but I kept hearing things. Small sounds, branches breaking, leaves shifting. Not much, but enough to make me second-guess myself. I felt eyes on me, even though I couldn't see anything. I was starting to think that maybe I wasn't alone in these woods, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. Then it happened again. A loud crack, followed by a soft rustle. This time, I didn't freeze. I started walking faster, my breath coming quicker. Every part of me screamed to turn around, to look, but I couldn't. I had to keep moving. I couldn't stand still. I didn't know what was out there, but I didn't want to find out. The trees around me seemed to grow thicker, their trunks pressing in, narrowing my path. It felt like they were closing in on me, trapping me. My steps were hurried, clumsy. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my legs feeling heavier with every step. I was slipping, falling behind myself. And then, in the midst of all that confusion, I saw something. A small clearing up ahead. I moved toward it instinctively. It was a break in the trees, a chance to catch my breath, to get a better sense of where I was. As I pushed through the last few branches, I stepped into the open space, and that's when I saw it. A cabin. It was old, weathered, and nearly swallowed by the surrounding woods, but it was there. There was no mistaking it. A cabin in the middle of nowhere. I didn't know whether to feel relief or terror. Relief because it meant I wasn't as far from civilization as I thought. Terror because I had no idea who or what might be living in that cabin. The door was shut, but I could see a faint light flickering through the cracks in the wood. I knew I had to decide quickly. Stay in the open, exposed to whatever might be lurking in the woods, or approach the cabin, unsure of who or what might be inside. There was no easy choice, but the cabin seemed like my best chance. I didn't know if anyone lived there, but I couldn't just stand in the clearing all night. I took a deep breath and made my way to the door. The wood creaked under my weight, and my heart was racing in my chest. My hand shook as I reached for the door. The knob turned, and I pushed it open, bracing myself for whatever lay inside. The cabin was empty. The light I had seen came from an old kerosene lamp, sitting on a wooden table by the window. The place smelled musty, like it hadn't been lived in for years. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners. The fire pit in the center of the room had long since gone cold, the ashes scattered on the stone. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, taking a moment to collect myself. The woods outside were terrifying, but at least I was inside now, safe for the moment. I didn't know what had brought me to this place, but as I looked around, I realized something that struck me like a punch to the gut. There was no sign of anyone, no signs of life, no evidence that anyone had been here recently. Yet the lamp was burning. Someone had to have been here. I searched the cabin in a frenzy, opening drawers, looking behind the furniture, but there was nothing. No food.
No supplies.
Nothing. I finally sat down on the floor, exhausted, defeated. I had no idea how I had ended up here, but one thing was clear. I wasn't alone in the woods, and I needed to find my way out before whatever it was that had been following me found me first. The sun had been setting for what felt like hours, its soft orange light weaving between the branches above. I glanced at my watch. It was well past 6 now. I should have started heading back long before, but I was too distracted. I had come into these woods just to clear my head. A simple hike, a way to disconnect for a few hours. I didn't plan on being out here as the darkness crept in. It was supposed to be a short trail. I had a map with me, a water bottle, and a light jacket. I was well prepared for what I thought would be a simple afternoon walk. But the forest had a way of swallowing time. The deeper I went, the more the surroundings changed. The path had become less clear, less obvious. The trees thickened, the underbrush grew taller, and before I knew it, the landmarks I thought I remembered were nowhere to be found. I retraced my steps, but nothing looked familiar. The trail markers that had been so clear when I first started were now hidden under overgrown branches and moss. My heart began to race as I glanced around, the sounds of birds and insects filling the air with an eerie hush, as if the forest was holding its breath. A sense of unease crept into my chest. I tried to push it away, telling myself I just needed to stay calm. There was no reason to panic. It was just a forest, after all. But it was getting darker. The shadows stretched longer across the ground, and the familiar warmth of the sun faded, replaced by the cool bite of night. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, hoping for a message, maybe a call, something to ground me. The screen was dead. I had forgotten to charge it. Of course, I swallowed hard. Okay, just focus. I turned around again, trying to find something, anything that might look familiar, but all I saw were towering trees and tangled vines. I felt a slight panic rise in my throat, but forced it down. I couldn't let myself get caught up in it. I took a deep breath and started walking in what I hoped was the right direction. The trail had disappeared. What I was walking on now was little more than a vague path through the forest, overgrown with thick weeds and roots. The air felt heavy, pressing down on my chest, and I could hear nothing but my own footsteps crunching on the underbrush. I pushed forward, stepping over fallen logs and ducking under branches that seemed to reach out, clawing at my skin. As the minutes passed, I began to lose track of time. Every tree looked the same. Every turn felt like it led me deeper into the woods. I felt the weight of the silence, as if the forest was somehow more alive than it should be. There was a heaviness in the air, a stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My breaths grew shorter, and my legs began to ache. The fear I had tried to suppress crept back in, a tight knot in my stomach. It was then that I heard something, a snap, like a twig breaking behind me. My body froze, my heart pounded in my chest. I turned around quickly, scanning the trees behind me. Nothing, only the deepening shadows and the occasional gust of wind rustling the leaves. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination, the woods playing tricks on me. I kept walking, but every few steps, I thought I heard another noise, a crack of a branch or the rustling of leaves. It was like something was following me, always just out of sight. My pulse quickened. I wasn't alone. I knew that much. The thought chilled me to the core. Was it an animal? Person? I tried to remember the basic survival tips I'd read online, but everything felt distant and useless in the moment. Minutes turned into hours. My mind raced with thoughts, trying to piece together any way to get out of this. I knew I had to stay calm, but the more I walked, the more desperate I became. I stopped at what I thought was a clearing, hoping for some sign of civilization. But all I found was more trees, more unrelenting forest. No roads, no signs, nothing. Just the unbroken canopy above me and the deep, quiet stillness around me. I was lost, really lost. As the last remnants of daylight disappeared, the forest seemed to close in around me. The darkness was complete now, suffocating. I fumbled in my jacket for a flashlight, but of course, I hadn't brought one. I hadn't planned for this. My thoughts spiraled into panic, my legs feeling like lead as I stumbled forward, trying to find my bearings. That's when I heard it again, the unmistakable snap of a twig. This time it was closer. A chill ran down my spine, and I whirled around, heart hammering in my chest. Nothing, just the shadows. But my mind was racing now. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. There was no logical reason for the fear building up inside me, but it was undeniable. I had to do something. I kept moving, my breathing shallow, my senses on high alert. I could barely think straight. There had to be a way out of here. There just had to be. The thought of spending another night in the woods was unbearable. I needed to find a way back. I needed to. Another snap. Closer. I wasn't imagining it this time. I stood frozen, the panic taking over. My eyes darted around, desperately searching for any sign of movement. A shadow flickered behind a tree, just for a moment, and my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but I couldn't move. I stood there, heart racing, waiting for the sound to come again. But it didn't. The forest was silent once more. I took a shaky step forward, then another. I was going to keep moving no matter what. I had to. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run as fast as I could. But I forced myself to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Panic was an anchor, weighing me down, but I couldn't afford to let it control me. Then, a distant light flickered in the distance. My eyes locked onto it, and my heart leaped in my chest. I wasn't imagining it. It was real. I ran towards the light, the fear spurring me on, pushing my body beyond its limits. The darkness seemed to press in even tighter, but the light was getting closer. It wasn't until I broke through the thick underbrush that I saw it. An old hunting cabin nestled between two large oaks, its warm light spilling out from a window. I reached the door, pounding on it with both hands. I didn't care who or what was inside. I was desperate. The door opened slowly, and a grizzled man in his late 50s stood there, blinking at me in surprise. "What the hell are you doing out here, kid?" he asked. I'm lost," I gasped, my voice trembling. "I've been out here for hours. Please, I need help." He took one look at me, then stepped aside. "Come in." As soon as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me, and the warmth of the cabin wrapped around me like a blanket. I collapsed into a chair by the fire, breathing heavily. "I thought I was going to die out there," I said, trying to steady my racing heartbeat. The man looked at me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Ain't nobody ever dies out here if they know how to listen to the woods." "You didn't." I was too tired to ask more questions. I just sat there, staring into the fire, feeling the last of the panic ebb away. I had been lost, but I wasn't anymore. I was safe. I thought the woods would be a simple trail hike, just a few hours of peaceful solitude in the wild, but the deeper I went, the more I started to feel wrong. It wasn't just the dense trees, the way they seemed to loom over me as I walked. It wasn't just the quiet, either, though that was unsettling in its own way. It was more than that. It was the feeling of being watched. I didn't know who or what was watching me. There were no other hikers, no sounds of birds or animals. Nothing. Just me, the path, and the heavy silence. I had been hiking for a few hours, and the map I had seemed simple enough. A loop trail, something easy, something beginner-friendly. It should have been a quick, relaxing getaway from my busy life. But the deeper I went, the less certain I became. The trail seemed to shift in subtle ways, taking me farther off the path I remembered. It wasn't as clear anymore. The markers were becoming harder to spot. I kept telling myself I was just overthinking it, that this was just part of the woods. But the woods weren't like I expected. They were different than the parks near my home. These trees felt older, somehow, like they had stories of their own that they weren't eager to share. I checked my watch. 3:15 p.m. I still had plenty of daylight left, so I decided to push on. But after another hour, I realized that the familiar markers, the trail signs, were gone. I turned around, but nothing looked familiar anymore. The trees had a way of shifting, twisting, bending in ways that seemed too intentional, as though the forest itself was leading me astray. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal, just a few faint bars, flickering and disappearing. The battery was low, and I couldn't remember if I'd charged it enough this morning. My heart rate increased. I tried to calm myself down. This was just a small detour. There's no need to panic. But the silence of the woods was suffocating now. Every snap of a twig underfoot felt too loud. The trees were growing closer together, blocking the sky, creating a canopy that made everything feel dim and suffocating. I kept walking, trying to remember the path, but my footsteps grew heavier with each step, like the earth was pulling me deeper. My legs were starting to ache. Sweat gathered at the back of my neck, and I wiped it away with the sleeve of my jacket. The forest felt different now, oppressive, almost. I felt like I wasn't alone, like something or someone was just beyond the trees, waiting. But every time I turned around, there was nothing, just the same endless trees. The thought of turning back should have been comforting. I'd gone off track, sure, but I could always retrace my steps, find the right way again. But it didn't feel that simple anymore. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. There was no clear path back, and I didn't trust the ground I walked on anymore. Felt unfamiliar, hostile. Each turn I made seemed to get me deeper, further from the way out. It was getting dark, quicker than I had expected. The sky above me, once a clear blue, was turning a dull shade of gray. I checked my watch again. 4:45 p.m. The sun was setting faster than I remembered. I tried to calm myself, but the woods felt like they were closing in on me. It wasn't just the lack of landmarks, it was something deeper. like I was being pulled into something. I had to make a decision. Keep walking or stop and wait for help. But how could I stop? Every part of me screamed to keep moving. Yet, the more I walked, the more I realized the trail wasn't a trail anymore. It was just a path through an endless stretch of trees. I paused, listening. I thought I heard something, rustling in the underbrush behind me. But when I spun around, I saw nothing. My pulse raced. I was losing my grip. I was losing time. I kept going, my mind in a haze of panic and exhaustion. I couldn't tell if I was retracing my steps or getting farther into the forest. The world around me was becoming more of a blur, the shadows deepening. The next few hours passed in a blur of confusion, frustration, and dread. I couldn't tell if the night was closing in on me or if it was the forest itself that had swallowed the sun. My watch was dead, the last bit of battery drained. My phone was useless now. I couldn't see the sky. The trees were so thick above me. I had no sense of direction anymore. I didn't want to admit it, but I was terrified. Terrified that I wasn't going to find my way out. Terrified that the woods weren't as empty as they seemed. The silence was deafening now. I hadn't heard a single bird or animal since I entered the forest. Not one sound from any living thing. Only the rustle of leaves under my boots and the wind, always a little too much, as though something else was moving in the trees with me. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it. A flicker of light ahead, a break in the trees. I wasn't sure if it was real, but it was there. It was distant but unmistakable. A soft, yellowish glow through the trees. I pushed forward, ignoring the thorns and branches that snagged my clothes. I was desperate now, beyond fear. I moved faster, stumbling over rocks and fallen branches, until the light grew clearer, and I realized I was at the edge of the forest. I stepped out of the trees and into an open field. My chest heaved as I sucked in a deep breath, inhaling the crisp air, free from the weight of the woods. It was a small clearing, a patch of grass that stretched to a dirt road. The kind of road you'd expect to see on a map, the kind that led somewhere. I looked around, my eyes adjusting to the dimming light. It was peaceful now, far from the suffocating darkness I'd left behind. I kept walking, following the road, until I finally saw a car parked in the distance. I quickened my pace, and when I got closer, I saw a figure standing by the car, just a person, waiting. It was a woman. She smiled when she saw me, her face illuminated by the car's headlights. I was too relieved to be confused. She opened the door, and without a word, I climbed in. She didn't ask any questions, but I didn't care. I was out. When I looked back one last time, I saw the woods stretching beyond the edge of the road, dark and still. They seemed so far away now, so distant. As the car drove away, I could have sworn I saw something move in the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone.